Japanimation Station.
'Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by Sean Chapman
and Jonathan Lack.
And we are here to bring you a very special episode of Japanimation Station because we are still hard at work on Season 5 and recording episodes for that. But a little something dropped that we thought we should do an episode on when it was still relevant and current, because Yamada Naoko, obviously one of the star directors of Kyoto Animation, that we covered all of her stuff with the KyoAni season. She left KyoAni in 2019. She has now put out her most recent film, which is The Colors Within, or also known as Kimi no Iro in Japanese, and that is currently in theaters in America as distributed by GKids. And Jonathan, you and I have both seen it. We have covered all of Yamada Naoko's stuff at KyoAni, and we thought, hey, let's just do a podcast. It doesn't need to be part of a season. It can just be its own episode.
Indeed. So you guys get something in the feed, so you know we're still alive. We're still working hard on Season 5, our grand tour. And yeah, I'm just shocked, Sean. I've learned what will get Sean Chapman out of his house and into a movie theater. Yes. And it turns out it is a new movie by Yamada Naoko. And I'm very happy because I saw this movie and it ended and I went, man, that was great, but I wish I could talk to Sean about it. But I'm going to have to wait for it to come to home video because he doesn't leave his house. And now I've learned you will go to the movie theater for this director, and I think that's great.
Yes, I think for me, the place I'm at with movie theaters is I only kind of feel compelled to see it if it is something that is obscure or like will only be out for a very limited time. I don't know. There's something that's like,
that's
and
fair.
Obviously Yamada Naoko puts it right at the top of the list. But like, there's for whatever reason, if it's something that's like, oh, that's trivially easy to go see, and it will be out on home video in like 2 months, and it will be nothing. I don't feel like the urge. But this, I'm like, yes. And luckily, it has like an actual release. It's not some weird, it's only going to be in 2 theaters on a Wednesday night kind of thing. It's you know, you just go see the movie. And so I was like, fuck it, I'll just go see the movie. And I saw it. And, you know, no surprise to anybody, it's amazing. It's an incredible movie. Yamada Naoko, you know, everything she has made is just, you know, incredible. And it's some of the best anime ever made. And it just is true of this movie also. And I was like, yeah, it's not shocking, but it is still, she's just that good.
I've been having a Yamada Naoko week here in Colorado because for my, I'm teaching at CU Boulder now. If you don't listen to Purely Academic, you might not know that, but I am officially Dr. Jonathan Lack now. And I have a teaching position at the University of Colorado, which is my alma mater for my undergrad and my master's. And one of the classes I am teaching is a 4,000 level class I'm calling Animation and Identification. And the first movie I showed was A Silent Voice, Yamada Naoko's 2016 movie with KyoAni. And because I was just trying to think, like, what's an animated movie that is like bold in form and will get people emotional and talking, and it's a silent voice. It's a silent voice. That's the one. There are other ones, but that's the one I kind of feel for this topic to kick things off. So kind of throwing my students in the deep end of the pool, but I think in a good way. And it was a complete coincidence because when I made the syllabus, GKids had not announced the release date for this movie. We knew they had it. They didn't have a release date yet. And it just turned out that the night it opened was the night that I was showing A Silent Voice. So it was kind of funny because this was playing on an IMAX near me, but I couldn't go because I was showing A Silent Voice at the exact same time. And I had to go the next day on a non-IMAX, which was totally fine. But I did get to tell my students, like, hey, She's got a new movie coming out right now. You can go see it. And one of my students was actually in the theater with me. He just showed up also at the screening of Kimi no Iro. So that was great. And it also meant that in my slides this week, I had to introduce Yamada Naoko and Kyoto Ani. And Sean, the hard part of that was limiting myself. Was like, okay, you and I did a year's worth of discussion and research. I could do a class on, easily do a class on Kyoto Animation with all that. And it's like, okay, how do I sum this up really quick? And I did the quick and dirty version, but tried to introduce, I think she is the most talented director of Japanese animation to emerge in the 21st century. I think certainly the most, singular. And just trying to introduce that, tell the kids about the kind of stuff she does. And then I did show a video that GKids put out of, they had flown her to, I think it was either New York or LA for a premiere, and they had her go to a record store and pick out some albums. And kind of like the Criterion Closet, but in a record store thing. Mm-hmm. And it was just her nerding out about music for 3 minutes. And I thought it was a great way to introduce her, shy but very erudite personality. So I showed that video, and then we watched A Silent Voice, and it was great.
Do you know, I didn't know how your classes work. Do you know, how the movie went over? Have you seen student responses in any way to it yet?
So we're going to be discussing it in class tomorrow from when we're recording this. But my feeling at the end of the movie was it went over really, really well. Several people in the class had already seen it, and they were, very excited that I was showing it. And I think everyone else, there was a lot of, oh, my God. And some of my students follow me on Letterboxd, so I see their stuff, too. And one person wrote, basically, I've never seen Japanese animation, screw that, animation in general, even tackle a story like this. And I'm like, yeah, that's pretty much right. So,
yes. Yeah. I'm glad that it seems like it went well. Because just Silent Voice is one of those movies to me that it has such huge, academic value, but it's also just, a very entertaining movie, which I think is true of all of her films, including The Colors Within. But particularly Silent Voice, because it's got this very, dramatic central subject that it's about. I think it's just, it's such a watchable film, even if it is emotionally devastating at various points.
Indeed. So, Colors Within, we will talk about that on today's episode as a little bonus, but a bit of housekeeping before we get started. 2 things. First off, yes, we do know about Gundam GKids. How do you say that?
GKids. It's the sound a duck makes, is I believe how it's pronounced.
Now I'm thinking of Quack Pack from the Disney Channel, but with mechas. How many people listening to this will know what Quack Pack was? Anyway, Gundam GKids, which is the show being made by Sunrise and Studio Kara. So it's basically the Evangelion people coming and doing a Gundam show. Yes, we will review the absolute fucking hell out of that once it's here. And we do know the theatrical premiere movie, also being distributed by GKids, is coming to the U.S. on February 28th. So hopefully we can get you to the theater for that one, Sean, and we can talk about that when it's here, because that sounds exciting.
Is that a school night? That is the determining factor.
No. Let me look up for you real quick. What is February 28th? February 28th is a Friday.
I could do that.
Yeah,
I can swing it Friday.
It's GKids, so that might just be a major, wide release. Not super wide, but I would guess that's just playing that whole weekend if that's opening on a Friday. Yeah.
The only thing, it just kills me when it's the kind of thing that it's only there for a Thursday or something.
Yes.
It's come on. There are some people who work jobs, and some of those jobs make people get up at 5:30 in the morning. And I can't do that. I can't go see a movie at 8 p.m. or whatever on a Thursday night. That's just not feasible.
Look, most weeaboos work weird jobs that give them a lot of leeway, but some are gainfully employed by the school system.
Yes, well, it's just, I just don't understand why those things aren't always on Fridays or weekends.
So yes, Weekly Suit Gundam will come back. I also feel like this has completely, proven the logic of us doing the Neon Genesis Evangelion episodes as part of Weekly Suit Gundam, because now they're just combining, and that's great. So we'll have all of that. But anyway, that is coming. Also coming, Season 5 of Japanimation Station, our grand tour. Finally, I think we are ready to announce a premiere date, and I have chosen a premiere date of Sunday, March 16th, 2025. And you might be saying, but Jonathan, you promised this in winter 2024-2025. Well, guess what, guys? I Googled when does winter end, and winter ends on March 20th. So March 16th is the final Sunday that I could do that and not be lying. So it is still coming this winter. Specifically, we will be premiering it on March 16th, 2025.
Yeah, I think that maybe there was a little bit of Icarus-like behavior that went on of both picking Dragon Ball GT, which is part of the season, and then also our recording period covering also the time in which you have upended your entire life because you graduated and all that shit, and you have moved, which obviously has also made recording times protracted from what we originally designed.
Yes.
So I'm glad that you're getting it on a raw technicality that it is still in the projected date. But to be fair, we do have good reasons for why it has taken us longer to put the season together than we originally projected.
Yes, there's been a bunch of life stuff in the way. Also, Dragon Ball GT was hard to get through. But I will say, I've been going back and editing some of these episodes. I think these are some of our best episodes ever. They're so good. Quickly, let's give you the rundown on what we're watching. The first 2 episodes are going to be Dragon Ball GT. When we announced that, we thought this was going to be coming out closer to the premiere of Dragon Ball Daima. I think Daima will be over by the time this premieres. But
yes,
okay, that's fine. We'll get to do the Dragon Ball Daima episode at some point, too. But we are reviewing GT over 2 episodes. That's going to be super fun. Then, Sean, what are we doing?
Then we are doing a Dororo special, where we are covering both versions of Dororo, the original 1969 version, which is the first anime we have covered in black and white, and also the oldest anime we have covered. And then we are doing the modern 2019 version of Dororo as well, so we get to kind of see the scope of those projects. Also secretly in there, if you want, there is a really sick PS2 game called Blood Will Tell, Tezuka Osama's Dororo, that is very, very hard to get a physical copy of, but you can very easily emulate it online and find a version that has the Japanese dub. We don't do an episode on that game, but I do talk about it because it's very fucking good, and I would recommend checking it out.
Then we're doing an episode continuing our little Tezuka streak on the Anime Rama trilogy, which is a series of films Tezuka's company made in the 60s and 70s called 1001 Nights, Cleopatra, and Belladonna of Sadness. Also the closest you're going to get to us reviewing hentai on this show, because it is erotic material also, because this is the era of pink films in Japan, and also also in America, the era of erotic movies in theaters. So we'll see how that goes.
Yes, I'm very excited to get to those. Then after that, we're getting to Welcome to the NHK, the TV series from 2006.
Then we're watching Yu-Gi-Oh! Not the one that you all know, but the 1998 Yu-Gi-Oh! Where Kaiba had green hair. It's made by Toei. It's never been made available on anything but VHS, and you do absolutely have to torrent it. But I think it's going to be worth it, because that show, I'm really excited to get to that one.
Yes.
That's the one where, speaking of Neon Genesis Evangelion, Ikari Shinji, Megumi Ogata, voices Yugi Moto.
Very good. Then after that, we're getting into Azumanga Daioh, the granddaddy of modern comedy anime.
Yes, from 2002. Then we're watching 1988's Gunbuster, Aim for the Top, another Evangelion connection, one of the original productions of Studio Gainax.
Yes, and then we're getting into a 2-part episodes where we're covering all things Dirty Pair. So we'll be doing one episode on the first season of Dirty Pair, and then a second episode on the second season and the movie of Dirty Pair, Project Eden.
It's a dirty pair of episodes on Dirty Pair. Then
exactly. They are lovely angels episodes, is what they would want to be referred to as.
Okay. Then for our season finale, we are doing one of the best anime ever made and one of our most requested anime ever made, which is 1997's Berserk, or as it is known in Japan, The Sword Wind Romance Berserk. That's the title of that anime in Japan, which was recently made available on Blu-ray from Discotek, so it's had a bit of a rediscovery over here, and very excited to talk about that.
Yes, I still need to get my Avengers 2 Blu-ray so I can get the red box and swap that out. I still need to get on top of that.
All right, so season 5, we are premiering on March 16th, 2025, and those will be the 12 episodes. It's going to be so exciting. I really think this is a special season. It's more work than we thought it was going to be. I think you and I thought, it's a collection of episodes. That'll be less work. No, it's actually more, because it means we have to restart the research process on every single one.
Yes.
But that's okay. That's okay. They're really good.
Yes, and I mean, again, you did decide to put Dragon Ball GT in there. It's a cross you're going to have to bear for the rest of your life, Jonathan, as you made us do this.
I think the episodes are good, and the art is what's ultimately worth it. Speaking of which,
I think the episodes of the podcast are good, just to be clear, because the episodes of Dragon Ball GT are not.
No, they're not. No. Yeah. The best episode of Dragon Ball GT is probably the very first one, and then it's downhill from there.
There's that one Goten one in the baby arc.
Yes,
That's
good.
That's like the good episode of Dragon Ball GT.
Yes. All right. Well, we're spoiling the season for people, Sean. So why don't we move ahead and talk about what is essentially an epilogue to our KyoAni season and a prologue to our inevitable but as yet unscheduled Science SARU season. And let's talk about Kimi no Iro, aka The Colors Within.
Yes. So I've put together just some brief notes here. I didn't want to go overboard, partially because the movie is so new that obviously there's like a lot of material that I assume will become a little bit more clear in terms of like, it's not on home video yet. So like you can't go through the credits very thoroughly. So we only know some like top line credits and things like that. And we will eventually do a Science SARU and Yuasa Masaki season whenever we can get to it. We obviously have lots of ideas for seasons, but we will get to that. And when we get there, I'm sure we will cover this movie again, and at that point, I will go buck fucking wild with the notes. But here, I just have like some brief notes and what I could put together on the people involved, which are almost all people we know. So just to kind of hook this up to where we left off with our Kyoto vacation, Yamada Naoko, she left KyoAni in 2019 after the arson attack that happened that summer. Right, so she, along with several other people, chose to leave KyoAni, obviously for understandable reasons. And fairly shortly after that, she went to Science SARU. Just a very brief note on Science SARU. Again, I'm not going to go in the weeds on this, but just for people who don't know about that studio, what it is, it's a studio founded by Yuasa Masaki, who is one of the greatest anime TV directors, has done some movies as well, but he's most notable for his TV work of the 21st century. Like his most recent thing is Keep Your Hands Off the Eizouken, which is one of the best like shows of the past 10 years, I think, easily in terms of.
Well,
TV
he also
anime.
made in his last movie is Inuo, which I think I called the second best movie of the year it came out. I mean, just fucking phenomenal. So yeah.
Yeah, he is an incredible director who has a very unique and very identifiable style. You know, I would call him an auteur director. I think he's in that kind of group of directors similar to a Yamada Naoko. So he founded the studio alongside his frequent collaborator, Eun-Young Cho, in 2013. So it's a very modern, recent studio. While nowhere near as independent as KyoAni or Ufotable, so this is not a thing of like they just handle the whole thing in-house necessarily. They do have more control over their projects than your average anime production studio these days. They do still do, you know, a lot of subcontracting, stuff like that, as is very typical. But it's not to the degree of most other animation studios. And they tackle a small number of projects. They're usually doing one or two things a year. They're not doing a huge, massive host of projects at the same time. And very notably, their projects are driven by strong central artistic visions, typically by people you would describe as an auteur, like Yuasa, like Yamada Naoko. One of their other people is Natsume Shingo, who is also a person like that. And then they've got a couple of younger people like the director of Dan Da Dan, which is obviously like the big hit show right now, that all have this sort of like big, strong, central artistic vision to them. So it's a very cool studio. Basically, everything they have done is very interesting and very creatively rich. They have also done a lot of collaboration with like kind of international stuff. So they have also done that Scott Pilgrim show, the Scott Pilgrim anime. And they've got a very distributed international kind of staff is one of the other things that's notable about them. So they have lots of people around the world contribute to Science SARU. So it's a pretty interesting, very modern studio. After joining Science SARU, Yamada directed her first TV series since Tamako Market, which is the show Heike Monogatari, which neither of us have seen, though I have the Blu-ray. We will get to Heike Monogatari when we do Science SARU, but that show came out in 2021 to a lot of critical acclaim. And for Heike Monogatari, very notably, Yamada brought on a lot of her major collaborators she had from her KyoAni days, specifically from her kind of from Silent Voice and Listen to the Blue Bird, where you have your writer, Yoshida Reiko, who of course she worked with like Yamada on everything, but then also the composer Ushio Kensuke, who came on with Silent Voice and then also Listen to the Blue Bird. So she kind of brought some of that core creative team with her over to Science SARU on that project. In 2022, Yamada announced that she'd be collaborating with that team, that trio again, on a movie produced by Science SARU, and that movie is what became Kimi no Iro, or The Colors Within. The movie released on August 30th, 2024 in Japan to critical acclaim. The movie had a modest box office run, not like a huge hit, but it did earn 360 million yen, which for some context, that is substantially better than Liz and the Bluebird, which was less than 100 million yen. And then also quite a bit better than Tamako Love Stories, over twice as much as Tamako Love Story, which was 124 million yen. It is obviously a far cry from the huge hits she's had, which are K.O. in the Movie and A Silent Voice, but those obviously are an adaptation of a hugely popular TV show, and then an adaptation of a hugely popular manga. So there's obviously reasons for why those movies did super well. But if you're looking this at her like more kind of original or slightly more obscure movies, you know, obviously Liz and the Bluebird is a sound euphonium movie, but they didn't put sound euphonium in the title of the movie, and it doesn't look like a sound euphonium movie. So I don't think it benefited from being a sound euphonium adaptation anyway. This is more successful than her other movies in that kind of sort of strata. The movie then began distribution by GKids in the States on January 24th with both Japanese and English dubs. The English title is The Colors Within, and I did notice the soundtrack is available online, and you can see on the cover of the soundtrack the words, "All is color within," with color spelled with British English, is on the soundtrack art. So I'm guessing that that Color Within title probably comes from the Japanese side of things. Just to kind of address the title thing up top, what the title is in Japanese, Kimi no Iro, which I think is a much better title than The Colors Within. It is a sort of pun where one of the main characters in the movie is named Kimi. So Kimi no Iro would mean Kimi's color, because Iro means color, but also the word Kimi can mean you. So it simultaneously means Kimi's color. It also means your color. And that's just like a very cool kind of artsy title. Obviously a title whose like meaning is so rooted in the specific Japanese language, you couldn't directly translate that. And so The Colors Within is serviceable, but I do like Kimi no Iro quite a bit more as the title for the film.
I agree 100%. And I think if I were doing it, I probably would have picked one of the meanings of the Japanese title and gone with that, either your color or Kimi's color. And like, okay, you're never going to be able to do both, but like get one. I think Colors Within kind of does neither, which is too bad. But yeah, Kimi no Iro is a very cool title because because I didn't know one of the main characters was named Kimi. So when I got into that point in the movie, I went, this is a clever title. And it was like, that was very cool. I also wanted to note, Sean, I did just look up, and one of Science SARU's other recent movies we just mentioned, Inuo, also made about 350 million yen in its box office run in Japan. So this is totally on par with their other films.
Yeah, it's like a respectable box office run for a movie of this style that obviously does not have, the like big clout of either a major adaptation or from one of like your really big hit directors like Mamoru Hosoda or someone like that.
Yeah, these are purely original stories. I mean, Inuo has historical resonances, but it's an original script by Yuasa.
Yeah. So let's break down some of the staff, which obviously the really big top-line people we know very well. So the director and in charge of the storyboards, as is true with all of her movies, is Yamada Naoko. So again, she did all the storyboards, which is important because I think this movie, if I read your Letterboxd review, I think you had a comment similar in yours, Jonathan, where I think she kind of definitively is like the best modern storyboarder, like ever. Like it's just like her skill in that regard is just kind of unfathomable, really. And it's
so singular. It's just, you can tell. You could show me any 30 seconds of something she's done, and it's just so obvious. Like, she just has a very distinctive style of composition and editing, and that's what storyboarding is. And yeah, it's very obvious here.
Yeah, and it's a 2-hour-long movie, so it's a hefty sized animated film to have one person do all the storyboards for. So it's pretty impressive. Yeah. Screenplay here is Yoshida Reiko, who again, she was the writer for every single thing that Yamada Naoko did at KyoAni and for Heike Monogatari. And it's cool to have her be able to do something that's not an adaptation. Obviously, she did that for Tamako Market and Tamako Love Story as well, as along with like a lot of other stuff that not Yamada Naoko related. But I always like to see these writers get to do stuff where they're flexing a different kind of muscle. And the screenplay is fantastic. Music here is Ushio Kensuke, who again, he came on with A Silent Voice. He also did the music on Liz and the Bluebird. He's done various other anime projects. He also, I know, is the composer for Dan Da Dan, which is the other Science SARU show going right now. So he's like all in the Science SARU stuff. Obviously, they had that trio again for Heike Monogatari. And we talked about with Silent Voice and Liz and the Bluebird that there is just such a sort of synergistic quality between Yamada and Ushio Kensuke, and they're kind of like creative interests in what they produce, and it's that kind of thing that you sometimes get these kind of composer-director pairs in films. That is just like a really potent combination, and it's cool to see that she has stuck with him for like almost 10 years at this point on various projects. So again, there's a lot of credits that we don't know, or I'm like a little bit iffy on where it's credited online because there's no home video release, so you can't scroll through all the credits individually. But there was a pamphlet in Japan where commonly you get pamphlets when you go to movies, and that did have the unit directors in it. And so I did find these credits online, and there's one name in particular that really jumped out to me. So the unit directors, there are 5 people credited as unit director, one of them being Yamada Naoko. The next one is Fujita Haruka, who she is credited with the A part of the movie and the second half of the C part. I do not know exactly where the divisions are there, but you can kind of think of the first fourth of the movie and like somewhere in the third fourth of the movie. And Fujita Haruka, for people who maybe don't remember, she is one of those big KyoAni people from the last section of KyoAni, where she's most notably one of the series Inshutsu on Violet Evergarden, and then the director of the first Violet Evergarden movie, Violet Evergarden Gaiden. And she also did a lot of stuff on Sound Euphonium, was one of like the main episode directors, doing some of the best episodes on that show that Yamada Naoko was heavily involved in. And she also, like Yamada Naoko, left KyoAni after 2019, after her movie came out, Violet Evergarden Gaiden. So it's cool to see she came in and did a lot of work on this movie, and that makes a lot of sense to me. But that's a really cool name to have here. One of the other unit directors is Tokido Daisuke. He is credited for the B part of the film. He did a lot of key animation for Heike Monogatari, and he's done storyboards and episode direction for several other notable shows. Ones that really stuck out to me were Attack on Titan. He did, I think it was episode 23 or 22 of Dororo, the 2019 Dororo, which we will talk about that show. We have talked about that show in our timeline. For you at home, you'll get that sometime in like April. And then he has also done that for Banana Fish. So he's done a lot of work. I assume the main reason he was pulled is for his work on Heike Monogatari. As you'll see when we get to a lot of the other credits, there is a lot of Yamada pulling people who worked on that show just directly into this movie. One of the other unit directors, for some reason, it didn't say what part he was in charge of. I assume he's in part of C part first half, because that's the only one that wasn't credited specifically. Maybe he tag teamed that with Yamada Naoko, I don't know. But we have Nagia Seishiro. His most notable project is he was the series director on a 2021 show called Backflip, with 2 exclamation points, which is like, you know how Free is the sexy swimming boys show? This is a sexy gymnastics boys show. Because Free obviously was a hugely popular show and inspired a lot of spin-offs, and there are a lot of sexy boy shows of various different kinds of school activities. This one was gymnastics. I don't know if the show is good or not, but that's the thing he was the director on.
Sean, Free is really the only like huge KyoAni thing, other than like their Full Metal Panic work that we didn't get to that season on our KyoAni show. Yeah. And so I think we're going to have to do a Sexy Boys Do Sports season at some point, where we do Free, we do Tsurune, we do Backflip, and whatever else we can find.
Yes, because there's a bunch of them. Like there's a shit ton of shows that you can tell what they are as soon as you see the poster, because it just looks like the poster for Free, only instead they're in a gymnasium or they're at an archery thing or whatever. It is very funny. Some other stuff that Nagia Seishiro has done. He was an episode director and did storyboards on an episode of Keep Your Hands Off the Eizouken, which is obviously Science SARU show and is fucking amazing. So that's big. And then he also did a lot of animation for the opening for Heike Monogatari. So that was his connection to that show. And then the last unit director we have here is Shimoyama Tomohisa, who he was in charge of the D part, which would be the last section of the movie. And he has done key animation on a lot of stuff. The credits that really jumped out to me was he's done key animation on a bunch of the modern Doraemon movies, which are huge hits, obviously. He did a lot of key animation on Eizouken. He did key animation on various other movies. One that really stuck out to me was Summer Wars. So he has not done a lot of direction stuff, but he's like done a lot of animation on a lot of really notable projects. And this was one of the only ones who he had no Heike Monogatari credit at all, but Eizouken is obviously a Science SARU show, so I assume that some connection there is how he got on the show.
I would assume that Yamada Naoko is aware of all the talent she has at her disposal at Science SARU. Yeah, Summer Wars, also a movie I'm showing to my students in a couple weeks.
There you go. You can maybe try to find on Sakagebodo. I bet you can find a clip that this dude did and say, hey,
Yes.
you know that Yamada Naoko thing? Well, she did a movie and this dude did unit direction on that, and then here's a shot
the D part.
animated.
Anyway,
Just go weirdly in the weeds for one specific person that is only tangentially connected to their material. So those are unit directors, a lot of obviously very talented people. And again, I just think it's really cool to see Fujita Haruka working with Yamada Naoko on another thing.
Yeah.
I hope that continues to happen because she is obviously awesome. Maybe that Science SARU can do a Fujita Haruka movie. That would be pretty
I was going to say, Science SARU cannot take on every auteur anime director in Japan, but if they want to give Fujita Haruka a show and or movie, I'm not complaining.
Yeah. It turns out that Violet Evergarden movie is pretty fucking good.
Yes.
So then in terms of some other credits we have, in terms of original character design, so the original kind of like drafts of the character design are by an online artist known as Daisuke Richard, all one word. He is an illustrator who he primarily works with like musical artists, so he does like a lot of cover art for albums and things like that. And this is his first anime credit. So he was in charge of like the original version of the characters, and then those character designs were then adapted to anime, and then also for animation direction, we have this credit for Kojima Takashi. He was the character designer and animation director on Heike Monogatari, so he just rolls right off of that show onto here. A couple of other things he did that role for is the show Flip Flappers, which I think that was like 2016 or so, which is not a good show because the writing is very dull, but it's a gorgeous looking show. Like it's one where like the animation is kind of worth watching the show, even if I think the characters and the story kind of fall flat. And if you watch that show, it will immediately make sense to you. You will see the connection aesthetically between that and this, which is cool. He also did the character design and animation direction for the Doraemon movie that came out in 2022, which had a very big title. And I just said 2020 Doraemon movie in my notes.
Yes.
In terms of some other credits I found here that I thought were interesting, art director is Muraoka Yuna. He was the assistant art director on a bunch of movies you have heard of, such as Weathering with You. He did background art on Suzume, on Belle, and Your Name, Kimi no Nawa. So like basically all like the really popular animated movies he did background art for, and or was an assistant art director on. So that's a pretty cool credit. Director of photography is Tomita Yoshimitsu. He was the assistant director of photography on Heike Monogatari because the main director of photography for that show is the one for Dan Da Dan. So they're kind of like splitting responsibilities there. But obviously that is, particularly for a Yamada Naoko movie, I feel like director of photography is a really notable credit because of the weird ass shit she does with like the photographic techniques. So I thought that was a credit I wanted to pull out, and I was able to find it. And then editing, I just pulled this because the same person from Heike Monogatari is Hirose Kiyoshi. So he was that on Heike Monogatari. He's done editing for a lot of other notable series like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Dan Da Dan, Look Back, and Mob Psycho 100, amongst a lot of others. But I think it was just very notable that for the limited number of credits we have access to, which is mostly only these ones that I pulled here, most of these people also worked on Heike Monogatari, which makes sense. But it just like sort of, it's cool to see that there's a consistency in the production there, because that is not always the case with modern anime. You can't just assume, oh, this director is doing work for this studio again. They're going to have that same creative team. That does not, that not only does that not always happen, that usually doesn't happen. And so Science SARU, it is sort of like to the credit of the studio that it is set up to have that work, whereas lots of other studios, that is not going to be the case.
Yes, and it makes sense that this is somewhere where Yamada has landed, because she clearly kind of has her own little domain within Science SARU to do what she wants. I think Yuasa is the same way. I mean, it is his studio that he founded, but you know what I mean. And yeah, makes sense why, like, you know, she hasn't needed to go off and follow the like Hosoda or Shinkai path of starting her own studio or something, because these opportunities exist.
Yes. So that's my main credits. I don't know, Jonathan, do you want to go on to the music and cast stuff, or you want to start getting into the movie?
Let's get into the movie, because if we start talking about the music, I'm never going to stop talking about the music. Yeah, because the music in this movie, Jesus, even knowing this is the fucking K-On! People, blew me out of my seat. So we'll talk about that in a bit. The Colors Within is a really interesting movie, Sean. It is... I want to describe it as a more sort of low-key, quiet film. And then I remember she also made Tamako Love Story. So, like, that is not unusual. Or even Liz and the Bluebird is kind of that way. But, like, I think what's interesting about it is it feels like she's revisiting a lot of the ideas and themes from her other work. It's about people forming a band, so you have the K-On! Connection there. It is about a main girl who has an unnamed, but like clearly some kind of like difference in like mental processing of the world, however you want to say that, which I think is very similar to the main character of Liz and the Bluebird, which we said was kind of like pseudo-autistic or like in that zone, right?
Yeah.
I think it's got very obvious like queer readings that you can do, which I think has been there throughout all of her films. And it's got, hyper-specific settings, which I think is also true of all of her work. That, like, in A Silent Voice, the main character lives with his single mother in a hair salon with his, like, sister's daughter who is mixed race because his sister is in a marriage with like an African man, and like so like just these very like specific character details you have here because it's set in a Catholic girls' school and on an island where a kid is the inheritor of the doctor legacy on this island. So like it's very obviously Yamada Naoko, and I think you could on paper look at that and go, what's new here? And I think this is just. I think her career is, too, such a pure example of what auteurism is in cinema, which is to say, and I've been going over this because I just the other day finished prepping a lecture for my intro to film students on the basics of what auteurism is, kind of the 101 version. But when you go back to, like, the people who first, like, tried to name this thing, like the French New Wave critics, one of the bold claims they've made that's been challenged since... But I honestly kind of think there's some wisdom to, like in the Francois Truffaut sense, is there's no such thing as a minor work by an auteur because the style that they have so, in his words, impregnates the subject matter that that's what you're interested in. It is not necessarily the individual works, it is the style of the person doing it, which I think is something we inherently understand when you talk about authors of books or painters or musicians, and I think we're still reluctant to fully embrace that for film. But when you look at this, and it's, the last Yamada Naoko thing we looked at is years before this, because we haven't seen Heike Monogatari. This is a different studio. It's a lot of different collaborators from her time at Kyoto Ani, although a lot of some of the hyper, like, top-level people are the same, like Yoshida Reiko. And it is just so her. And I think what distinguishes this film isn't the specific story. It is the style. It is the mood. It is the atmosphere that it brings to it. Like, that to me is like a like proof point for like the very like original uncut version of auteur theory that was really hardcore and has me like rethinking things as I like prepping this lecture. So I hope that makes sense, but that's kind of my opening like reaction to watching this, and because I watched A Silent Voice right before it, had me thinking all this too.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with everything you're saying there. I think there's something about Kimi no Ito, or The Colors Within, that it's like a hyper version of the Yamada Naoko movie, not in the sense that it is hyperactive, but in the sense that it is like it sort of like embodies to extremes a lot of the trends you see in her work, whether it's her movies or some of her episodes at Kyoto Ani. And especially because it's fully original, I think it really emphasizes certain things about her style that some of her other stuff does not. Because I think the thing that's really, really notable about this movie to me is just how mellow and low-key it is. Like, there is precious little in terms of drama in this movie, in like the way we kind of typically use it. And that's true of like a lot of her stuff. Obviously, this is the director of K-On!, which is a series that, sparked an entire debate about like, does this have a story? What is the plot in a show? That kind of stuff.
But remember, K-On! Gets more like that in its second season when she and Yoshida Reiko are off the manga at a certain point. So like, and I think Tamako Love Story is the other one you can most say this about, which is also fully original.
Yeah, but even those, I would say, are maybe like, the K-On!'s a little bit different because K-On! is a comedy. So like, what drama is for a series like K-On! is different than it is for something like this or her other stuff that are more romantic in nature or dramatic in nature. But even something like Tamako Love Story has the love story at the center of it, which is dramatic. It has like big, powerful emotions and really big, powerful emotional scenes that really tug at your heartstrings in like kind of blatant and obvious ways. It being blatant and obvious isn't bad. That's just the nature of most stories. It's clear that you're meant to feel something very potent for these characters because they're in very emotionally heightened scenarios. And then this is also true. This is most true of A Silent Voice because obviously the source material is very extreme, very emotionally potent source material that she's pulling from. And that one is the most dramatic of kind of everything she's done because that has like life and death style stakes to it, which her works do not typically have. And then Liz and the Blue Bird is probably the thing that's most similar to this. But even that, I think the drama between, I think it's Mizoda and Nozomi, I think are the characters' names, but the two leads of that movie, the drama there to me is still more heightened and more emotionally intense than what you get in this movie. And that's, I think, just like really fascinating because on the surface, the setup for this movie sounds like it would be a fairly schmaltzy teen drama, right? You've got these three teenagers, one of whom has quit school and has lied about that and hasn't told her parents or guardian, and she's kind of run to this sort of pseudo rock band kind of thing in order to kind of deal with the emotions of that. Another one is someone whose family is sort of like implicitly pressuring him into succeeding the sort of like family job that he doesn't maybe all fully want to do, and really he wants to get into music. And then you also have our main character. There's also like the slight suggestion of a sort of love triangle there, that this movie is not actually doing a love triangle thing, but any other movie that has all these pieces would be doing a love triangle. They would have really big heightened dramatic scenes. They would have Dewey, the dude who's like struggling on, should I join the family clinic and take over that business? Like, we have all seen movies that have these pieces, and you expect your really big cathartic, emotional, dramatic moments with these characters where they break down into tears and things like that. And this movie just doesn't have that. Like, it's got all those pieces, but the drama and the emotional space is so heavily internalized in the characters that it's all about how they are feeling. It is not about the sort of like conflict that the characters are having with their parental figures or anything like that. It's like, it's not interested in the points of pressure that those plot points in other movies are interested in. It's purely interested in like the subjective emotional experience of these three kids, and it's just exploring that. And so it has this super low-key, super mellow, chill kind of atmosphere and vibe to it that is, I think, very emotionally rich, and it does have a very emotional impact to it at the end. Like, I was tearing up at the end of the movie during the musical performance, but not because it's doing the kinds of things that usually make you tear up in movies. I think it's just like a powerful cumulative effect of the atmosphere and the space and the characters that are created by the film. And I think there is just a really powerful Yamada Naoko-ness to that quality of, let's keep it super low-key. Let's make it hyper-internal. Let's make it so subjective to these characters and their specific emotional experiences. And let's like sand down a lot of the more dramatic high points you'd expect a movie like this to have and the kind of cliches you'd expect this movie to have. And I think that is the thing that makes this like a quintessentially Yamada Naoko film, because nobody else would do this plot this way. Like, nobody else would do it anywhere close to this.
Well, and that's the auteur thing that I'm talking about, right? Is that it's so about form. And I think this movie, like, you would get nothing reading the Wikipedia summary of this movie. That's something I've been stressing to my intro to film students, is that what's the difference between form and content? And it's like, if we're just in here to talk about stories, we can talk about Wikipedia summaries. We have to focus on form, and good movies use form. And this is so formal. And, you know, one of the direct through lines is also to Liz and the Bluebird, which is her most different thing at Kyoto Animation, and probably, like, on a production level, the most different thing KyoAni has made to date, I think, in terms of aesthetics. And part of it is because that's where she really starts going with, like, internal expressive realities, and she starts having, like, she has the obvious, like, different art style for the, like, storybook portions of Liz and the Bluebird, but also that's where you start getting the scenes that are just like splashes of color across the screen for a couple frames, and little, like, bits of, like, internal, you know, thought process like that. And those pop up here and there in her other work. A Silent Voice obviously does this very heavily with the way the main character sees the X's over people's faces, although I believe that's a technique borrowed from the manga. But it fits very well with her sort of style as well. And I was thinking with this, because she pushes it much further with The Colors Within, which has whole sequences that are just like watercolors going across the screen, and where the backgrounds go away and the main character, we just see how she sees the world in a different way. This is definitely a movie after Miyazaki Hayao's own heart in the amount of watercolor on screen, you know? And I just, obviously I love seeing watercolors in movies because it's cool. But there is something like very much about, this is less about the things that are going to happen to these characters, because in a plot sense, I mean, for the main two girls, almost nothing has happened. And for Rui, he's gone to college, which was his plan at the beginning of the movie. And yet, emotionally, they've covered so much ground. And so the movie's form is all about tracing that emotional ground. And it's pretty bold in that way. And it also, I was thinking, like, what is the thing that made Yamada Naoko want to kind of spread her wings from KyoAni? And I know the fire is one of the direct impetuses for very understandable reasons. But I also think when you look at this, I mean, we talked about this with Liz and the Bluebird, that the themes of that movie are about someone who is like too big for their surroundings and needing to fly free. And I think that describes her. But I also think when you look at this movie, it's not like Kyoto Animation is rigid in any way, but they do have something of a house style that you can tell what a KyoAni thing is. And I do wonder when you look at this if it's like, she needed a place where she could go even kind of, I think, bolder out in those directions. And I think Science SARU being, because no two Science SARU things quite look alike. I think there's something like that going on here. And I think that's part of what I was just noticing watching this movie is a lot of it is like so identifiably Yamada Naoko. You can see the things she learned from other people at Kyoto Animation, like the amount of stuff with like very physical grounded camera angles, the cutaways to just random things in the environment, or, looking at the characters' feet while they're talking. Like all of that, is from Haruhi on, that stuff that she picked up, but also all the stuff that is very much her, but then also picking up on the things that like, okay, I don't think she would have done this quite this way with that team. And I thought that was interesting. And part of it is just how quiet and internal it is.
And part of it is also just it being able to be a fully original story.
Yes.
Like I think it's like it being a truly original production just gives it space for her to make it so wholly her own, along with obviously like these key creative people that she really trusts and has collaborated with really deeply on multiple projects at this point, and with Yoshida Reiko for almost 20 years at this point.
Yes.
Their partnership has been so rich and so long. That I think that just sort of affords this movie to be very wholly its own thing. In a way that I can imagine this movie being off-putting to some people because of how low-key it is. Like it's so intensely mellow in terms of its overall vibe, which I really love, but I definitely could get the sense. I think my theater was like a little like more or less half full, which was honestly more people than I was expecting. And I got the vibe that there were some people that were way into it, and I think there were some people that were not, just based on like hearing conversations coming out of the theater. There was one group of people that were having a very in-depth conversation about A Silent Voice. I'm like, oh, that's good. They went to see this movie because they knew what this movie was properly, like all the way through, which is cool. But yeah, like I think this movie, it really goes to really extreme places in terms of that stylization, which I think is really to its credit because of how far it goes. But yes, it is the most like you can't read the Wikipedia summary and understand anything about what this movie is, because if you read the Wikipedia summary, you're thinking this is going to like a totally generic teen band movie, and it like has the form or the shape of a teen band movie, but it's not that. Like that's just not what it's about. It's just about existing in this space with these people for about 2 hours and going through that emotional experience with them. And it really could be about anything. It's just that Yamada Naoko obviously really loves music, and so it's going to be about a music related thing.
Yes. And like in a very specific way, where I think this movie also clarified to me why it's not just that she likes music, but why that and animation are so intertwined for her. And I think it's because they are two things that tap into super internal realities, right? Like her movies, and watching this in A Silent Voice back-to-back clarified for me, both in the original story she tells and in the adaptational stories she is drawn to as an artist. Because, she wasn't just assigned A Silent Voice or Liz and the Bluebird, as we covered at the time. She asked for these things and, fought for them. And I think the thing you see is that she is so interested in people who feel, for whatever reason, like they are on the outside looking in. Some kind of disconnect, some kind of inability to socialize the same way as normal people, whether normal, quote unquote. But like,
Yeah.
you know, whether that is, I think there's, you know, clear depression and trauma in A Silent Voice. There's physical disability in A Silent Voice with the deafness, but there's also like, you know, there's the shades of autism in Liz and the Bluebird. In Tamako Market, it's just a street full of weirdos who live in their own little world. You know, honestly, Tamako is like probably the most normal character she's ever had at the center of one of her works, but still there's that kind of sense of something where you look at other people and there's something holding you back from socializing in a way that you would understand as normal. And I think that is a very hard feeling to convey on film. I feel it very intensely in the world. And it's why I think I connect to her work so powerfully. And I think it's something that you can kind of only express through animation if you're talking about film. And I think in other mediums, music is also one of the things you could express that through really powerfully. And I think those two things become very intertwined because of that. And then all of her stories are about those people finding somebody or something that takes them out of that shell, makes them come alive. In this case, you know, it's music. It is also just making it literal, the idea of color in this movie, which I think is like a very obvious metaphor for thinking about what animation is, what art is. It's both a synesthetic thing that is going on here, but I think also a broad, like, metaphorical representation of how you can see people and represent them through art. And I think this movie just distills that because it's not about any big plot structuring around that. It's not about the sort of like time gap that is in A Silent Voice and the past and future trauma stuff. It's not about, you know, sort of school deadlines that you get in K-On! Or like the relative like plot structuring of those things. It really is just about those feelings for these three people who are all facing minor, but to them emotionally large hinge points in their life. And I think the way it illustrates that, and then climaxes in just a full unbroken concert scene that is like the dream of you know, I think of K-On! And other shows that have done this, of just do the climax through the music and not break that, I think is the thing that like ties this movie together and makes it great. And yeah, I found it overwhelmingly powerful by the end.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's like really interesting about it is that climax is not a thing that's like super clearly set up in the early points of the movie. You know, like you get pretty far, like over the halfway point of the movie before the notion of this festival even comes up, right? So it's not like something like K-On! Where you have this clear goal in mind of, oh, like eventually we'll get to the cultural festival and we got to play the song, or then for season 2 / the movie we're going to graduate, we want to, in the movie, we want to make the song for Azusa, right? And also just a side note with K-On! Obviously also fits into your overall schema of stories she's interested in there to a more comic effect, but the 4 main girls of After School Tea Time are all fucking insane weirdos who they're like the only friends they really have are kind of each other and or like Ui, you know, Yui's sister. And one of the things that's great about that show is that like Azusa is a relatively normal person who enters that equation, and that's one of the things that makes K-On! So good. But yeah, that's like you know how it fits into that whole kind of thing you were just establishing. But all her other movies have some kind of sort of like central goal that you're really looking towards. And in Liz and the Blue Bird, that has like the fucking concert that they're auditioning for and all of that. So it's got this very clear, like, you're an arrow pointing you to where and how is this movie going to end? Well, it's going to end with something related to this concert and Nozomi having to make, and Mizore having to make big choices about what they're going to do and what that's going to mean about their relationship. Here, it's just like the characters fucking vibing, man. Like they're just going through the world. They're like loosely practicing some music. They're just sort of bouncing off of each other. And then you get the whole element of Tozuko sneaking Kimi into the school, which that's like the big dramatic center point of the movie is like, oh, she gets caught for that, which is a very kind of like low key kind of like element that occurs. And then the sister sort of has this spur of a moment revelation of like, oh, I should get them to do this Valentine's Day thing, and maybe that will help these girls get over this. But that's like, it's so late in the movie that's introduced. So even the notion of like this movie's going to end with a concert is not this sort of like clear predetermined plot structure that you're like inevitably building towards. It feels like it is a plot event that occurs because the emotional reality of the characters demands that it happens. And that's just one of those things that when we're talking about like the structure and how mellow and kind of like insular and subjective and internal the movie feels, like that's part of where that comes from, is that it is not plotted the way you'd expect this kind of movie to be plotted, with really clear pillars in the story that sort of anchor you to really specific points. And instead it's so just about the emotional experience of the characters that the plot stuff just takes so kind of like a back step from all those things. And I think one of the things that really emphasizes that Yamada Naoko is so incredible as a director is building setting and building place, and how like good her sense of like the world is. Because that is, I think, the thing that helps guide you through this movie is the atmosphere and the tone and the space, which is a thing that we've talked about with basically all of her stuff. That's kind of what you're also saying with like how really specific the settings are, like whether it's the shopping district in Tamako Market, or it's the whole like school and community and home life of the main character for A Silent Voice, or you're talking about like the school for A Sound Euphonium, which is both kind of in some ways almost distinct feeling places between the show, which does a good job of building up what that school is like, and the movie, which has, because it's so through Mizore's perspective, it is like almost like a different feeling place in that film because of that subjective experience of it. But they all feel like real places that you are like navigating through as a viewer. And I think that's the thing that this movie maybe emphasizes more than anything else she's done, is how central that is for the experience of a Yamada Naoko project, of how much that world and that lived in space, in that sense that you as a viewer just sort of like melt into it. And for me, like watching this movie, I completely lost track of like time. I felt like I was in a sort of like gestalt state, like I was not actively aware of all the other stuff going on around me, because, and this is true of like when you watch A Silent Voice as well, I think very particularly with that movie, you just lose all sense of everything else because you get so absorbed into the world and setting and tone and place that is established by the film. And all that is just through like the subtle use of visuals and music and editing and pacing all come together to just like melt you into this whole pot that the movie takes place in. And Kimi no Ito is so excellent at doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something I did think about, and I was writing down extra notes on this after I wrote my little Letterboxd review, is just the specificity of place. And I think if you're talking about things that define her as a director, that's part of it. Because, again, in all her works, I think if you look at the very absolute, like, topmost story summary thing, you could assign these characters into archetypes that are recognizable, and characters you've seen in other movies. You were saying that about like that this is a two girls, one guy triangle, and they form a band, and you look at that on paper and it sounds like a million other anime you've seen, but I don't think her characters ever feel like types because of the specificity of place. Tamako Market is obviously the most obvious version of this, because she created this whole shopping district full of weirdos that even has a magical bird person wandering around and doing stuff and pooping on people or whatever he does. And it's hilarious. But in this one, like, how many anime can you say you've seen that have a Christian setting but isn't doing it in like the Neon Genesis Evangelion way of, this is like cool attire and iconography that we're going to use for our action or something. Like, but also isn't trying to make any kind of grand statement about religion, I don't think. Like, I think the movie I think it lets you kind of read into it what you want, but you watch the beginning of this movie and it starts with her making the prayer that in the Western world I think we're most familiar with, like with Alcoholics Anonymous, which is God grant me, it's the Serenity Prayer, the serenity to accept what I cannot change and change what I can. And you think that like the movie's, I think by the end, going to have a major denouement or thesis around that idea. And it kind of does, in that there's this final little there's a scene near the end of Rui talking to his parents and Kimi talking to her grandmother about dropping out of school and that idea of, coming clean. But I don't think it feels like a grand, like, this is the message of the movie kind of thing. It's a thing we've built to and has come out of this setting. But I think it is interested in the, like, Catholic girls' school not as just a place of aesthetic value or a place for a kind of, like, dogmatic belief-based story, but as a setting, a place where people live and they believe things, but they also move through the world and they live with other people. And the nuns are not a monolith under those, veils. Like there's like people under there. And I think that alone is kind of startling to me in here. And I'm even just taking it out of the concept of Japanese animation. I think like most stories that like get this close to religion want to make a bigger statement with it. And then what I think they sometimes lose is observing it as a setting. And this movie doesn't lose that.
Yeah, and specifically like the Catholic girls' school setting is both in anime and not anime. It is so typically used for the like for the transgression of it, of that, like you have, here's all these girls, it is a homosexual community, right? In like, or a monosexual community that is going to have like, a homoerotic and homosexual component to it. This is like very specifically a tradition it has in anime, alongside other things, but anime does do this a lot, and did this a lot in like the 70s and 80s. This is where your Yuri anime comes from, and Yuri manga, but I guess more specifically in anime. And part of that is that like the transgressive element of the homosexuality juxtaposed with God and the holy and those things that are meant to restrict that. And it's about that juxtaposition of sex, sexuality, and religion. And that's also like, obviously the whole cliche of like the sexy nun and like, that whole thing. I mean, it's a very potent area in erotica, just generally speaking. And so it is so typically used in that way. And there is just something that, as you say, that's like really interesting to watch, something that obviously doesn't have any of that element. It's like not trying to play into any of those tropes at all. Even though it does have a very clear like queer reading to the movie, it is not trying to play into that version of more almost kind of like sexploitation kind of media, even though it's got that kind of setting. But it neither does that, nor does it do, as you're saying, the thing of like we have to make the idea of religion and spirituality a central like feature of the movie and the plot and its characters, which is a like just inevitable draw that I think so many stories have, that like they just can't get out of the gravity of that, even if they're trying to. The gravity of that notion is so powerful that the story can't escape it. And yeah, here it's just, you don't feel it like that way at all. It's so casual. Like, and also that Totsuko is someone who like practices this stuff, right? And she knows the prayers and she does the cross and she says amen. It's part of the song that she writes. But it is not a like we need some sort of like spiritual intervention at some point in the movie that you have to read like, is this like a metaphor for God or that kind of thing? That is how like the climaxes of these kinds of movies or stories with this sort of setting will normally go. It just avoids that at all. And as you say, it is purely a feature of the setting and it's completely lived in, and it could be anywhere else. And if it were anywhere else, she would render it with the kind of detail she has done here. I think she was just interested in this kind of place, in this kind of setting. It is based on like a real girls' school. They went and they did, this is some stuff I saw in my research. They went and obviously did like location scouting and all that kind of stuff and a lot of research, because this is not like Yamada Naoko herself did not have that kind of background. But it just, I think, jumped out to her as like an interesting place and an interesting world to set the movie in. And so that's where she went to.
I guess, yeah, another way to say it is that it feels like it approaches it with a genuine curiosity, not an agenda. And I think, and I use the word agenda there, not loaded neither necessarily in either direction, but agenda is a loaded word. Like, right? Yeah. Like, usually, I think when someone tells a story with religion this close to its center, they have some kind of agenda in one direction or another. And we can interpret that as positive or negative or whatever based on our priors as well. But I don't feel like this story comes into it with like strong priors on that. It comes into it with an interest in like, okay, how would a character like Totsuka, who lives in this setting, and it is not necessarily a shackle to her, but it is a set of walls, and it is like a thing, and she has to find herself, like, what is that? And I love that. And I think that's true of a lot of Yamada Naoko's work, is that just curiosity of, let's follow the character, let's follow the story, let's not start from a predetermined sort of thematic outcome and work backwards, because I think you can find really rich thematic reservoirs through there. Because I do think the movie has a lot you can say about, like, religion and religious spaces and all of that in here. And, like, there is an implicit connection drawn between religion, spirituality, and music as something that is just kind of inherently holy, and you can read holy as either literally an aspect of a god existing in the world, or as just something that is bigger than human beings and crosses our boundaries. Because where is the music made in the movie? In a hollowed out church on this remote island that they have to take a ferry to, where the main instrument the movie focuses on is a theremin, where you are literally playing with thin air. Like, there's something profoundly spiritual and religious, like, in that zone, but I like that it is something that it wants you to experience, and let that play to you however it plays. It's not dogmatic or didactic in that sense.
Yeah, well, I think it's so much of it is about, like, how do you do this work to enrich yourself and kind of understand yourself and grow and develop. And there are many ways to do that. Religion is one tool that gets you there. Music is another. And this is like the thing that all three of the protagonists are trying to navigate. And her religious connection is one thing that Totsuko uses to help her do that. And she's also, obviously, she's the character that has like the least kind of dramatic central element. Like, her whole drama is much more low key, because her whole drama is about like her inability to see or understand herself as something special and beautiful the way that she's able to see other people, right? Because she cannot see her own color, and so she, I think, undervalues herself. And it's through her relationship with these characters is how she kind of is able to develop that sense of self and kind of grow and evolve beyond her boundaries. But then obviously Dewey and Kimi have these big issues about like where are they going in the future. But those issues are not ones of like, we need to change what we're doing. Like, the movie is not about Kimi needs to go back to school, nor is it about like she needs to become a rock star. And it's not about Dewey needs to become a rock star or join or like embrace his passion for music and give up the clinic. Like, it's not even like considering, well, I have an option to not join the clinic. I think he does want to take on the clinic. It's that he is struggling with, but that's not the only thing I want to do. I have other things I want to be able to explore and do as well. And he's just not yet mature enough to be able to balance out that equation in his life. And so this relationship with his friends, his being able to explore music with other people, that just gives him the space to grow and mature and to be able to accept these multiple parts of his life, that they are not in conflict with each other, that they can all exist in harmony, right? And so that sort of like the spirituality or the religious element is just one tool or one facet in this larger equation of all these characters trying to sort of figure out, how do I grow and develop? What do I want to be? And how do I do that? And those struggles are purely internal for all the characters. They are not really about making some sort of action on the world to change their circumstances. It's about them coming to terms with their circumstances and who they are and what they want to be. And it's about an emotional development. And so obviously, like, religion and spirituality is all an internal, you cannot see it, you cannot feel it, you cannot touch it. It does not practically exist. But for the people that experience it, it is a purely internal phenomenon.
Yes, absolutely. And then there is also the, like, just, I want to talk about the queer element of the movie. Because I think it's really interesting because it is there, and I think it can be kind of as pervasive as you want it to be, but it isn't named. And it isn't consummated. And I think sometimes with a less deft hand, that would frustrate me. Like, I would say, choose one direction or the other. But I think throughout her career, this is something Yamada Naoko has been very good at. And I don't think it's because she makes this movie and Science SARU told her, you can't say the word gay anywhere in the movie or anything, right? I think if she wanted to make it more explicit, she could. And I think there's something about, with everything we're talking about, that there is kind of a room for you to read it in the way you want to and find yourself in the movie the way you might find yourself. And I think, to me, what's good, and I think that's true of some of her other work as well. I think it's how she steered parts of the first season of Sound Euphonium before I think it was steered in other directions later on, that I think part of why it's disappointing is because it closed off an openness that was there early on. But we talked about this with Liz and the Bluebird as well. There is a way you can read that as a queer love story. And I think here I wouldn't even say to the love story angle, but there's the literal of, do you take Totsuka seeing a unique color in Kimi and being infatuated with this woman as a queer story, do you take a lot of like Rui's characteristics, which code as, I think, gay in some ways, and take that as a queer story? Or do you broaden it even further in the way that queer theory and academia often does and say, well, this is a story about three people who feel in some way on the outcasts of society and like they can't relate to other people, and that is a queering of the content, and there is a queerness to the story in that way that, again, as I was saying, kind of allows you to read yourself or your world and your friends into it in kind of whatever way you want. And it makes it very like delicate to talk about, but I think part of why it's powerful is that it is not made explicit or concretized for us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it is because, she has done an explicitly queer character before in Tamako Market / Tamako Love Story. We have the one girl who's in love with Tamako, right? So It's like it is not a thing where I think she is, afraid of broaching that and making it explicit. But I do think with these characters, I think it is like valuable for it to be this very, as you kind of call it, very open space, as kind of everything in the movie is. And it is because it is also so subjective for the characters. Because there is this you have that really potent scene in the kind of last third of the movie where all three of them are stranded on the island because the snow has come in, and they're all in the church at night, and Dewey has brought the sleeping bags and stuff, and it's all candlelit, and they're sitting around, and it is where all the characters kind of open up about themselves and tell their kind of deepest hidden secrets, which is also obviously their kind of central character element. For Dewey, it is his whole complex with the clinic. For Kimi, it's her complex about having quit school and lied about it. And then for Totsuko, it is her ability to see people as colors, or not just her ability, but the way she sees people is as colors. She has no control over it, and she has learned to hide that from people because it weirds them out. Right. And so she has not told anyone about that seemingly for a very, very long time. And that part of that is also she cannot see her own color because Kimi asks her that in that scene. And then Dewey has this little comment where he says something about isn't this so amazing? We're all sitting around here just talking about secrets of love or whatever. I forget what the exact line is, but it's something like that. He says the word I in Japanese. And so there is this sort of very weird, queer context to that scene where it is very deeply intimate, and it is between all three of these people, but none of them have any sort of explicitly romantic connection. The closest you get is Kimi. It has this kind of infatuation with Dewey. She demonstrates very early in the movie when he comes into the space of the bookstore, and she kind of is spying on him. Where I think she does have you're meant to read it. She has some kind of crush on this hot guy who shows up, but I think it becomes something more than that, right? It's not. I don't think it's just she loves him. The movie notably does not end with her screaming "I love you" when he's going away on the boat. She screams "Do your best," because I think the way I read it is she sees herself reflected in this boy, right? And that they all kind of become one entity in that way. In the ending of the movie, as this band, they're kind of one unit, and they all share the same problems. They all need to grow in similar ways. And so, that's where I think this sort of openness, the vagueness, the undefined and undefinable nature of their relationship that has love and this love for each other as a central component, but is not something that I think can be defined in your more kind of broken down traditional notions of sexual love and romance. It is something that is kind of beyond those more kind of social constructs of how relationships work.
I think it is valuable to not only tell stories about identity through the prism of romance and two people in a, amorous love. I think it is valuable to have stories about identity like this, where I think a lot of those same dynamics play into it. And I think if you are someone who, came out in high school and understood yourself as having a different kind of attraction than other people in your social sphere and came to terms with that, I think you could see a lot of yourself in this movie. And I think you could probably see parts of yourself, just in the image of Totsuko seeing Kimi throw the volleyball and this explosion of color, and then it hits you. Because the movie isn't then winnowing it down into the form that is both a social form and a narrative form of a romance, there's a lot of other space for that identity to get expressed. And I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And part of why this is difficult to talk about is because Yamada Naoko is interested in these intangibles, you know? Mm-hmm. And it's something that is true of all of her work. I think she is interested in things that are hard to concretize into words, but can be expressed through things like animation and music. And that's what this movie does a lot of, obviously. If you want to talk about the main three characters, another thing that I want to note that I think feels subtly different from her Kyoto Animation work is the voice acting. Because Kyoto Animation always works with the best of the best seiyuu in the business, right? And sometimes I think they will be directed in ways that feel very different. I think a silent voice does this, like Irino Mio has never given a performance quite like that one in a silent voice, and it's a really raw, astonishing performance. But it is still a performance from a highly trained, accomplished voice actor, right? And what Yamada Naoko has done here is gone full Ghibli and gone with either newcomers or people who don't generally voice in anime. And I did find that really interesting throughout this movie, and sometimes like disarming just how either untrained or untrained for anime these voices are, because they're very raw.
Yeah, because and to do a little bit more with that with the KyoAni thing, like really what KyoAni has historically done is for supporting characters, they go for very established actors. Most of the time, though, for the main characters, they go with relative unknowns and newcomers that then inevitably go on to be the biggest people in the industry, right? Like Nakamura Yuichi was not Nakamura Yuichi when he was cast as the lead in Clannad, nor was Ono Daisuke when he was cast as the lead in Air, nor were any of the girls of Can, right? So like, you know, they've historically gone with relative unknowns for the main crew, or sometimes with like they have their kind of like band of returning regulars that obviously they've gone to at various points. That's kind of shifted a little bit over the years, but notably, like when they go for newer people that are maybe a little bit more raw, they're still getting people whose career is being a voice actor, right? There are people who have gone to school to be a voice actor whose career is that they want to be voice actors, and that's the thing that's very different here. Yes, they're going for like younger people who are not particularly experienced, but they're also not people who are voice actors. So all three actors that play the leads are all three film and TV actors. And then also the woman who plays Sister Hiyoko, who's the next most prominent character in the movie, is a much more experienced actress, but is someone who is a TV and film actress. And yeah, I do think it is like an interesting kind of shift in the approach. But it makes sense, I think, just for like the style of the movie. I think there's something that's so raw about the visual style she has gone for, that it matches having a less trained kind of voice to come out of these characters, because these characters don't look like anime characters the way you normally think of them as. The style of the movie is so singular that it works to have this kind of less trained, more raw, more naturalistic performance coming from them.
Well, like Takaishi Akari, who voices Kimi, she speaks in almost a whisper throughout this movie. Like, it's aggressively quiet. Like, you need like a pretty good sound system in your theater to render the nuances of that performance. And like, that's not completely unusual from Yamada's work. Like, she directs Irino Miyu in silent voice as Shoya to be really quiet. Like, that is a direction to him. But it is still like there's something that's another level of astonishing to me, to the point that it's almost frustrating to the viewer just how quiet and closed in she is. I don't mean frustrating and I think this is bad, but like you want to get into her more. And you can tell the logic of it when you get to the end of the movie, because the final thing in the movie is her screaming out this thing. And like it has the power it does because you have felt that voice so bottled up for the entire movie up until that point. And so there's a real logic to it. But do you want to tell us about these three actors who voice the main characters?
Yeah, so our lead, Higurashi Totsuko, is voiced by Suzukawa Sayu, who she is like the most new of all the actors in the movie. She's only 19 years old. I presume she would have been 18 when she was actually doing most of the recording for the movie. She has been in a really tiny handful of TV shows and movies, but all of her stuff, as far as I can tell, are supporting character roles. I don't think she's been like the lead in anything. And based on what I read, this was like the character that they spent the most time trying to cast, because there was a very long, extended, elaborate audition process that ultimately involved 1,600 different actresses. So out of all of those, she is the one who was chosen. And I find that very interesting because she is the one that feels the most like a voice actress to me of all the leads, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think, like, I would not be shocked at all if she has, like, pivots to doing more voice acting because she is really good. And Totsuko is the most complicated of the characters to play because Totsuko has, like, she is the most animated, right? She is a character who, like, deforms in, like, comical ways, and, like, you know, she's so incredibly expressive, and she has to be very comic throughout much of the movie. And she got like a bunch of big laughs, that character, in my movie theater. Like, and not like there's like not huge jokes. It's just the character, the person is inherently funny in the way she exists because she's just like a goofball. You know, she's very much in the vein of a Yui from K-On! In fact, like, I would love to see Totsuko and Yui hang out because it would be ridiculous. But I think that that's just like a hard character to play, and it's a very sort of animated or sort of cartoonish character in some ways, because of how much the character herself takes advantage of the animated form in order to exist. Like, I have a hard time imagining Totsuko in a live-action version of Kimi no Iro, in a way that I think you could do a live-action version of Kimi. You could do a live-action version of Ryui. Like, that's not crazy. Totsuko is a character that feels like she has to exist in animation in order for her to exist. So I think, like, that performance, especially for someone who's so young, who had done no voice acting before this, it's really impressive because she sounds untrained, but she doesn't sound like she's not a voice actress to me, if that makes sense, compared to the other ones.
No, that makes sense. And I think exactly what you're saying there is right. If they were looking through 1,600 actresses, I think it is that balance between someone who can play a very literally animated character while also sounding kind of raw and new and untrained. And that's a weird dynamic to try to find, but I think she absolutely nails it. Obviously a wonderful character. And one thing I want to say without letting it go completely unsaid is I think is interesting in the character design is she's a little overweight. Like, that's a thing that is, like, in the movie also, that I think when you're thinking about identity is that, like, it's not cartoonish, it's not super exaggerated, it's not even really highlighted in, like, the text of the movie, but it is something that is pretty rare to see in media in general for main characters of your work, and I think in anime in particular, where I think, you know, the legacy of moe characteristics and whatnot often guides us towards thinner, like, hyper skinny sometimes characters, and she's not that. And I think that also just makes her feel a little more like real, and I think there's a lot you can read into it because of that, and it's just something I really appreciated in the film.
Yeah, and that they obviously never use it as, like, a huge joke that, like, she's eating a whole lot or anything like that, which is nice, because that's usually, if you have a character who is on the larger side as your lead, that is usually where it ends up going, as a source of comedy, and they don't do that, which is very, very nice. Then our next character here, we have Takeshi Akiri, plays Sakunaga Kimi. She's about 22 years old, so a bit older than the actress who plays Totsuko, though obviously not by a whole lot. She has a much more prominent career in TV, movie, and on stage. She's been in a lot, including recently she was Nezuko in the stage version of Kimetsu no Yaiba, which is just a credit that I saw. I'm like, oh, that's cool. But she has been the lead in a bunch of stuff. Like, she is the lead in a trilogy of movies called Baby Walkure. Like, I don't know what those movies are about, but she's the main character in them. And those movies have been coming out since 2021. There are 3 of them. And she has been the lead in, or one of the main characters in, various TV shows and movies. So while she's very young, she is a much more kind of notable actress in terms of her overall career. But this is her first anime role. She's not done any voice acting based on anything I saw. And also interesting is she is not someone who has, like, a music career either. I don't know if singing is a part of roles she has done, but she doesn't have, like, singles, you know, which is for a character who does a lot of singing in the movie, because she does all of her own singing. I thought it was interesting that they didn't necessarily go for an actress that has a big musical career. Obviously, I think she's a very good singer. Like, I think her voice sounds really good. But it jumped out to me because I was kind of expecting it to have been someone who has a little bit more of a musical side to her career.
I'm looking this up now. Baby Walkure, I think that Walkure is supposed to be Valkyrie, and it's also translated, it's been localized here as Baby Assassins.
Yes, I saw that.
And it looks fun. High schoolers and teenage assassins Chisato and Mahiro must find a way to fix their relationship in the midst of finding part-time jobs and dealing with the Yakuza. I'm sold. I want to watch that. That sounds fun. Anyway, but yeah, no, that's interesting. And I mean, it also plays, like, her voice in the songs is great, but it's very believably the voice of someone who is not like a trained singer who has a pop career, you know?
Right.
And yeah, it's a great performance. It's an also just awesome like character design. I think the way she moves through the movie, I like the contrast between how closed in she is through a lot of it, and then this vibrant explosion of color that Totsuko sees in her. And as we go through the movie, trying to tease out where does that come from? That like, what is Kimi's color? What is the like substance of that? And I think particularly that comes to a head in the whole scene where they spend the night together in the dorm. And it's just wonderful.
Yeah, it's a great character. It's a great performance. I love her, as you're saying, like the character design is so striking. It reminds me a little bit of what I think Yamada Naoko and the team were going for in K-On! With Mio for that show, where she is like,
yes,
like very striking. She has very sharp features, like the way they draw her eyes. Obviously, it's a very different show aesthetically, but I think it's the same kind of person they're kind of drawing out. Obviously here, though, not as comedic. But if Totsuko is our Yui, Kimi is our Mio. Like, I think there's a clear kind of similarity there in terms of...
Okay, now tell me which one Rui is.
So we do have Dewey. I guess he'd be the Moogie of them, like if he's any of them. But yes,
he does play the keyboards, so yes. Yeah.
And he's just like the most oddball of them in many ways. Like, I know Totsuko seems like she's the most oddball, but Dewey is the most oddball. Like, that dude is a fucking weirdo. Yeah, we'll get to him. So we've got...
Said lovingly. Lovingly.
Oh, no, I love him. He's a great character, but he's a weirdo. Taisei Kido is the actor here who played Kagehira Dewey. He is older. I think he's 29. I didn't put in my notes, but he's the oldest of the three. And he's a TV and movie actor who's been working since 2017. His first major role is he's a regular on an educational children's show called Otosanto Isho, or With My Dad, is what it translates to. And like the others, this is his first anime role. But again, he has like a much bigger career than the other ones because he's just been working for a lot longer. Though, again, not in a voice acting capacity. But I think that makes sense. He's also the oldest of the three. He's, I think, supposed to be 1 year older than the other two because he's graduating and going to college at the end of the movie. And yeah, Dewey is an interesting character because he's clearly like the least prominent of the three, right? Like Totsuko and Kimi kind of like own the movie. I mean, Kimi's name is in the title. Totsuko is our main character. But I think it really matches Dewey because he is a very like aloof and kind of like enigmatic person. So you don't get into his life as much, but when you see it, I love how much of a kind of an oddball he is. You know, like he is this kid who seems like he's a super loner, but not by choice. And so he's so like overly affectionate at various points in the movie, which I think really works. Like, you know, he's got this kind of goofy dance he starts doing when they're starting to play some of the songs, when he can't see them for a long time because they're doing the community service or whatever, and they come back, he runs over and hugs both of them and is jumping up and down and shouting. And it's just, you know, based on his introduction, he looks like, oh, it's the cool kid who's in a band and he's like a little bit older, right? That's kind of how you're introduced to the character. And he gets to be in that realm for the first half of the movie or so because he's so distant and aloof. It takes a lot longer for you to kind of get into what his deal is. But the more you learn about him, the more you realize like, oh, he is just like, he exists in kind of a slightly different world than everybody else. He is on this island with this like small island community, and he goes to the church and he's able to use this like abandoned church that is a historical site or whatever because he cleans it, and then he finds like weird old used musical equipment and computers and shit and goes there on his own to go play music. And like your impression is more or less the first friends he has ever had are Totsuko and Kimi, because presumably he has almost nobody else his age that he hangs out with because he's part of this very small community who knows how many like kids or young people even live on that island. And I love how even though you do not get a lot of time with him, he does not have as much screen time as the others, he feels as much of a real person, as much as a lived-in character as Totsuko and Kimi, just because the glimpses you get and the juxtaposition of how he changes over the course of the movie are so suggestive of his whole life. That I really feel like you get to know him so well, even in the spaces where he's not present.
Yeah, I think at some point in the movie, maybe my thought was, maybe there's not enough of him. I think I was thinking that around the time we have the long scene where they're in the dorm together, Totsuko and Kimi. But then you get like the flip side of that scene, which is all of them on the island together when the storm happens. Mm-hmm. And I think that completely, like, I think in the balance with the full movie, I was like, I think it's perfectly balanced. Because, yeah, he's, and I think it makes sense because he is a more distant character just in the sense that he literally lives over here on this island and he's going to leave them at the end of the year because he's going to college. But I think
he's a boy. Like him
boy,
being
yeah.
the only guy, like creates this natural distance between the characters early on that, particularly from Kimi's perspective, I think she sees him as a very different person than he actually is at the very beginning, which is part of where the crush stuff comes from. And then that obviously evolves over the course of the movie where, as I said, I think like what happens is that they all identify as they are all the same kind of person. So her shouting, "Ganbare, do your best" at the end of the movie and exploding with that emotion is her also saying that to herself because of how their relationship has changed.
Yes. He also has, I think, if you want to, despite like the whole explosion of colors theme that Totsuko has for Kimi, I think he has the most obvious like coming out narrative if you want to trace a queer arc onto it, where the coming out is for "I do music, mom," but it really reads as like a little, like, because the music thing doesn't literally affect the doctor theme in the same way that if you're telling your doctor parents you're gay, that has no bearing on you being a doctor, but it is like an identity thing that you need to share with these people who are important in your life. And I think obviously his whole like the way I think he is characterized and voiced and designed has that reading kind of built into it, like, you know, and how he continually comes out of his shell as he is accepted, because he has a different kind of put on at the beginning of the movie. So I think that's also something I find very compelling about the character.
And then, you know, then his instrument of choice is a theremin, which is like very like a really interesting kind of oddball thing. I mean, it's the kind of thing that Mugi would play, or at least she'd try to play. I don't know if she'd be good at it or not, but she would definitely want to in K.O. And yeah, like it's just a cool instrument to choose for animation specifically, because it's like, it's such a strange thing to animate. It's like someone their hand just hovering and vibrating in the air, you know?
We've talked about this a lot with the KyoAni season, because KyoAni has so many shows that deal with music in one way or another, that the great challenge of animating music isn't just that instruments are complex things and human bodies are complex things, it's the interaction between them, right? Mm-hmm. Like, the reason the Live Alive sequence in Haruhi astonishes so much is because the fingering on the guitar is like so fucking precise. And it is, when you're animating these things one frame at a time, and you have to get the timing and everything, and the physicality of how does a finger interact with a fret or a string or anything like that, it blows your mind. I think Yamada Naoko feels like she set herself like, okay, well, I made K-On!, I co-directed Sound Euphonium, I directed Liz and the Bluebird, I've done guitars, I've done singing, I've done clarinets, I've done oboes. What's the next challenge? And it's like theremin, where the hand is interacting with nothing, but you have to give a sense that it is physically making music still, and in some ways blows me away more than any of those other things, because you have to have the hand in empty space, but the space isn't actually fully empty. It kind of blows my mind. I would love to know the full process. I mean, I'm sure they did what they did on Sound Euphonium and K.O.N. and went and studied musicians and all that, but it is astonishingly good animation, and I think the theremin scenes and like how it connects to everything else the movie is about like, the theremin is like just such a good metaphor as an instrument for what this movie is about, which is like empty spaces where a lot of stuff is actually happening. That's the movie, and that is what a theremin is. And those scenes, I think, are just pure magic. And then the way it works into the songs at the end is so fucking cool. It's part of why like the songs at the end sound like nothing you've seen in this kind of movie or show before, is the presence of the theremin. I love it.
Yeah, and then obviously it also gives Ushio Kensuke a tool to use in the instrumental, like the background music as well, that features it in a couple of places there. And I am curious, I didn't see in my, I dug a little bit for it, but I couldn't find anything that specified. I don't know who is the person who decided on the theremin, because I'd love to know, is it Yamada Naoko or was it Ushio Kensuke? Because I could believe either, right? That he would have come up and been like, you know what would be a pretty sick instrument to be able to use, because obviously he composed all the songs, including the band's songs. So, you know, I wonder if he was like, I would love to do some theremin shit. I don't know where that originally originated from, but it is a really cool choice that, as you say, it just sets this whole movie apart. And it's so synergistic with the themes of the movie. It's synergistic with the notion of like Kimi's whole thing is very similar because it's so abstract. So her ability to like see colors where colors don't exist is the same thing as I'm able to produce music where there is nothing there. Like it's just all, it just gels perfectly with everything in the movie, and it's super cool.
Yes. Sean, my headcanon for who came up with it is that they came up with it at the same time, and then they sat up bolt upright and called each other and screamed theremin into the phone because they had both had thought at the same time, because that sounds like what would actually have happened.
Yeah. But it's wherever it came from, genius choice. We do have a couple of other actors I want to shout out here for the movie as well. The other most prominent character by far, obviously, is Sister Hyoko, who is voiced by Aragaki Yui. She is a much, much more prominent TV and voice actress, or TV and film actress, than any of the leads, because she has been regularly playing lead roles in TV and movies and stuff since like 2004 or 5. So she's like a popular TV film actress in Japan, and has been for a long time at this point. But she has technically been in some anime. It is not by far her like main thing. It's like 3 or 4 roles, but she has been in, I believe it's one of the Keto Gunso movies, or Sergeant Frog is what's called. People might know better by that name. She is in one of the Cran Shinchan movies. And was also, this is the weirdest one, she's a character in Digimon Data Squad, which is one of the Digimon TV series. And that's the one that I see. I'm like, that's a weird one, because Sergeant Frog and Cran Shinchan are mainstream enough that I could buy, like, oh yeah, you get like this popular TV actress to do a character in one of the movies. Digimon is like a weird one. So that's an interesting choice. But she's great as Sister Hyoko. Sister Hyoko is just a great character. I love that she's basically the Sawa-chan sensei in our like K-On! Metaphor here. But she is like Sawa-chan sensei to an extreme, because she is so much more repressed about her rock star history. But I love it's because it is basically like the dramatic version of the episode from K-On! Where they find out that Sawa-chan was this like crazy heavy metal rock star when she was younger.
Yes.
That they do that again here with the whole... Oh, it's like, what is it? Is the God is Almighty or whatever it is that's carved in the bed?
God Almighty is what it says.
God Almighty. Yeah. And that's the thing that Totsuko is constantly praying to. And then you find out that that's like this whole thing that was her band or whatever when Sister Hyoko was younger. And I just love that. And because I also just love hearing them say the English words God Almighty, but obviously in their Japanese accents, and it makes it very clear this is not your Catholic version of God Almighty. No, this is your Japanese heavy metal band that thinks it's fucking edgy and cool to call themselves in English God Almighty, and it just totally shifts your whole perspective on that character and the world, and it's fucking perfect. Like that is such a great little moment at the end of this movie that makes that character come together so like holistically. I just adore it.
Yes, and I think the whole character is wonderful, and that it's also just something you, as you peel back the layers of this movie, I think at the beginning you expect the nuns to be more of a barrier to these characters. Mm-hmm. And there are barriers to overcome. They have to do their community service, and they're not able to play for a couple weeks there at the end. But Sister Hyoko is not interested in like tamping down who Totsuko is. She's interested in like putting it into a productive direction, right? And I think the way that plays out is really lovely, and is something I like a lot.
Yeah, and just the moment where it comes out that she was in the band God Almighty, and Totsuko has that whole revelation, and then she says like, oh, like how I wish I could forget that past, and then Totsuko turns it on her and says, oh, well, we have to learn to be able to accept the things you don't have the power to change.
Fucking great, yeah.
It's just so good. It's just a great kind of climax to that character and her role in the film. And then we do have a few supporting characters that I want to shout out because here we have our more kind of some more traditional voice actresses here. The first one here is not a traditional voice actress. So one of Totsuko's roommates, she got her 3 roommates that are kind of a little like comic trio in the movie. One of them is voiced by Yasuko, who is just a like popular Japanese comedian. So she's not necessarily a voice actress, though she's done voice acting, but she's like a comedian. But then the other two are some Yamada Naoko alums. So we have one of them, the character Nanakuba Shiho, is voiced by Yuki Aoi, who obviously is a voice actress who's in everything under the sun, but more notably for the purposes of this movie, she is the younger sister from A Silent Voice, and then she's also the lead character in Heike Monogatari, so she's obviously been in major Yamada Naoko stuff. And then the third of the roommates, the character Yatsushika Sumika, is voiced by Kotobuki Minako, who is, of course, the voice of Mugi, from K-On! And so it's nice to have her there. And I did love, for like the viewing experience for me, in the credits of the movie, you know, as is kind of typical for this kind of stuff, only a couple of names end up being subtitled because there's too much text for it to be subtitled, because it's just the Japanese credits on screen. And like the first name that popped up that I saw was in English, just Kotobuki Minako. I'm like, what? Mugi was in this movie? Because obviously it's hard to tell. The character's not like very prominent, but that was a happy surprise for me. It was like, yes, we got one of the K-On! Girls got to be in here, and that's very exciting. Again, those characters are not super prominent, but they are like, they do a lot to build the world of that school, and I love the little room that they all share. You have that great scene of all three of them doing the impressions of the nuns while Totsuko is writing her song. Like, that's just such a juicy scene. That is like the most Tamako Market scene in the movie, because Tamako has that whole room that she shares with her little sister in that show. It just like sort of gets the vibes of that stuff so well. And so all three of those actresses do a very good job in those kind of supporting roles.
Absolutely. And then, of course, we have Inoue Kikuko as Rui's mom, because, as you wrote in your notes, of course. And if you missed the Kyoto Animation season, or just anime of the last 30 years, she's the mom in everything. And, of course, Yamada Naoko carries that tradition forward because, fuck it. That's what she was raised in this industry learning, which is that if you have a mom, you cast Inoue Kikuko. Doesn't matter where you are in life, that's what you do. And it's correct. It is objectively correct.
It was the right choice, yeah. It's like, yes. It is. This is the one that, like, I couldn't tell with the roommates. I wasn't able to tell the voice actress is there, but as soon as the character opened her mouth, I'm like, yep, I could have. You didn't even need to say anything, and I could have guessed who the voice actress is going to be for the character, but for good reason, because it's a very minor character. She only has a few lines in the movie, but if it's going to be a mom, it's got to be Inoue Kikuko. That's how the world works.
Yep. All right. Let's talk about the songs. Let's talk about these fucking songs, Sean.
Yeah.
They're so good. They're so good. And again, we hear bits and pieces of them being written over the course of the movie, but then the climax of this film is just the full concert. The songs are all played. They're played one after another. We have cutaways to other things and various expressionistic moments, but it is the full thing. There's no, like, we cut to commercial break and we come back and they've done a couple songs off screen, because there is no commercial break. It's a movie. But, like, I loved this so profoundly.
Yeah, because I was a little bit frustrated at earlier parts of the movie in the moment where they kept on doing like, oh, they're starting to play a song and then it cuts away, which is a thing that you just want to hear the songs. Obviously, like, that's the thing that happens in K-On! And Sound Euphonium. It happens in all music-based anime. But then the question is, do you do that for a reason because you're building up to the song later? And luckily that is what they're doing, because then it those early frustrations are, just there to set up how satisfying it is to just get the full experience. Because obviously you don't want to play the same song 5 times in the course of the movie. I'm not saying that they should have just done the songs there.
Right.
That would have gotten very tedious by the time you got to the end of the film. But it does just set up this like expectation. If you've heard snapshots of these songs, the only one you've gotten like a big chunks of is and I'm Going Somewhere, which is Totsuko's song. But the other two, you've just gotten like, those are the ones where you see them really writing the song over the course of the movie, the apology letter, then Kimi's song Walk. And you kind of see them like kind of putting together the lyrics, and then like Dewey will come up with a riff. And so you do see the little process of them kind of putting the songs together. And then it comes together, as you said, in a full uninterrupted 3-song concert, just one after the other. And it's so good. All 3 songs are great. And I love how different all 3 songs are. Obviously, that is like there to represent that all 3 people in the band are all like unique individuals that bring their own thing, because they all touch all 3 of the songs. But each song, I think, represents one of the 3 characters. The first one, Apology Letter for Dewey, Walk for Kimi, I'm Going Somewhere for Totsuko. And it's just, all 3 songs I think are awesome, and they serve the right purpose in the movie, because the shape of all three of them are so good, where Apology Letter is this very kind of mysterious song, and it's very enigmatic feeling. That's the one that most prominently uses the theremin for long sections of it. Then Walk, which also uses a lot of theremin, is so somber and so dark and kind of so it's so heavy. And then I'm Going Somewhere is like your sick dance beats. And it's Totsuko and her like sunshine and her ridiculous, very Yui-esque lyrics from K-On!, because the lyrics of the song are absolute nonsense in the best way possible, that tie it all together. And that like emotional arc through the three songs is also very, very well done for the story of the movie, but also just for the composition of the music itself.
It's not just that these songs are different from each other, it's that they're different from anything I've heard in an anime like this before. Because these are not attempting to be character songs in the way that, like, the songs in the Live Alive episode of Haruhi are, or the way all the K-On! Songs are, or anything like that. And I'm not putting those songs down. You can go listen to the podcast. We adore those songs. But those songs are in part, like, fucking bops that are meant to sell the singles, right? Right. And I feel like that consideration, I think these are bops that could sell big singles, but I don't think that's like number one on the goal for these. Like, they are such parts of the movie. K-On! Did this well, where you could feel like these are songs that come from these characters and that they could have written, but they still had a little bit of a sheen of like, they are still written and recorded by like pop makers who know what they're doing. And like, there's a professionalism to them that is a little bit out of step with like what the characters are. And I think here you just see the characters in these three songs so heavily, down to the first one, Apology Letter. Like, Totsuko's whole role in that on the keyboards, which she is an amateur at the beginning of the movie, is 2 fingers back and forth, right? It's something that she plays more complex stuff in Walk and Amen, but never that complex. And like, the beats that Rui has made, you can feel are like, yeah, this is something that someone could do in their garage, with these things they've found. I feel like there's a little bit you can feel an influence, because we're 10 years on from, more than that now, from K-On!, we're like 15 years on. I feel like you can feel like the Billie Eilish like effect on all of this, and like, not just specifically Billie Eilish, but the whole movement of people who have come to make music just literally in their bedrooms with consumer tools. And I think so it's a different mode of music than the kind of J-pop that you got back then. This feels like very modern to 2024. But you can so feel like where everything comes from. The way the songs are mixed in the sound mix, and then if you listen to them on the soundtrack, is so good. You can hear every instrument. You can hear everything everybody is doing, because they want you to be able to hear what the characters are directly contributing. And I think like that is a huge part of it. And then just as a dramatic sequence, and this is something that absolutely Yamada Naoko learned from her time at KyoAni, because I think the first big one like this is Live Alive in Haruhi. And it is the songs that they have there, where that is a big dramatic sequence that is not just about showing off our cool music and animation, but that there's a dramatic thing going on here with Kyon in the audience realizing what Haruhi has done, and that she has done something weirdly selfless, and that she has come out of her shell, but in a much more positive way than her usual, let's put everybody in a maid outfit kind of way. And so there's a real dramatic arc to that sequence. K-On! Does this over and over. Sound Euphonium is generally very good at it, and it's one of the things that disappointed me about the third season, is because it doesn't really have big musical performance scenes. It wasn't able to do this. But like Liz and the Bluebird, the big scene where it's not even a performance, it's their basically audition with the teacher, is the version of this. But I feel like this might be the best version of this kind of scene I've ever seen. And part of it is it's in a movie, it's fully original, and it just gives itself the time to let the drama of the scene play. And the way you see the crowd go from like confusion, because this is a weird thing to be hearing in a Catholic girls' school Valentine's Day thing, to by the end, all the nuns are dancing to the music because Amen, I'm Going Somewhere is such a fucking bop. Like, the drama of the scene without any dialogue. It's just the singing and the lyrics and the sound. And it is a long period to have nothing else, and to have the drama play out through that. Absolutely fucking remarkable. Even knowing that this is something Yamada Naoko is really good at, because we've seen her do it over and over again, it still blew me back in my seat.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like one of the things that in this movie that feels different than these similar scenes in previous ones, and I think the one that's closest to this is the Liz and the Blue Bird one, But because this movie is so heavily internalized, because the drama is so low stakes, that like it feels so kind of subtle, the ways in which the music embodies the transformative experience these characters have had, because you don't have like a single thing to pin it on, like Mizore, like her embracing her like bluebirdness and saying like, I'm not going to be restrained, and even if that is going to sort of complicate this relationship she has with Nozomi, she's not going to hold back from it. Like there's just such a clear dramatic like a character point there between the two leads in that movie, that it's a lot easier to sort of feel and describe the exact function, like the plot function of that moment. Whereas here, because like the plot is so thin, like yes, there is a thing of like Kimi and Nui have told their respective parental figures to come to the concert, like that is kind of there. So there's like a little bit of something, but so much of it is so abstract of like, how does this show, or why is this the climax of the movie? Like, what is this showing you about the characters, or telling or communicating about the characters, that makes it the climax? And I do think that because the movie has been so internal and laid back and mellow and chill, and has turned the drama dial down so far in the overall mix of the film, that it makes the experience of watching it so organic in terms of how the emotions come out of you feeling like, oh yes, these three people have grown so much, and this is showing that to you. And it made me, that this is, I think, partially like the high school teacher part of me. That's kind of, I can't turn off when I watch this sort of stuff. But it made me feel like the parent of the audience, like I'm watching and being like, yes, oh, you have taken the hardships you've gone through and the things you've struggled, and through that you have grown as a person. And that growth is very intangible in the way that music is intangible, but it is so clearly still there. And I just think I would say it's the organic nature of where it just grows and evolves naturally out of the whole form and shape of the movie, rather than it feeling like a necessary consequences of the plot, that makes it a really potent scene. And I was really shocked at how moved I was by it, because it's not a scene that feels like it is sort of designed in a lab to make you moved in those ways, in the ways that like A Silent Voice, and this is nothing bad about that movie, but obviously the nature of the content of that movie, you're not surprised that it's tugging at your heartstrings at various points, because it's so intense, and the journeys the characters have are so powerful and so complex, and are so, but also are ones that you can kind of like define in some places in more clear terms. Whereas here, it's like, it's not, I can't see people in the face. It's not, I'm being bullied, or it's not like I have trauma. It's like just this normal, I'm having a hard time growing up because growing up is hard. I'm having a hard time connecting with people and finding people because that's hard. I'm having a hard time seeing myself as someone like special because that is hard, and it's hard to see yourself in that way. And here's this moment where all three of those characters demonstrate that growth they needed just through playing these three songs. It is a really, really beautiful climax to the film.
I last week taught my students in Intro to Film Hollywood 3-act structure, and I briefly mentioned to them that, there are similar things like this around the world, and I mentioned the Kisho Tenketsu structure of Japanese stories. And I was thinking about this while watching this movie. You absolutely could not map Hollywood 3-act structure onto this, but I do think it does broadly fit a Kisho Tenketsu. As, like, light as it is, there is still the twist, the 10 in that, and I think you could label that either as them getting caught at the school or the storm on the island, but there is something that like ruptures the story a little bit. But I think what's really powerful is that this moment is like the definition to me of that final step, the ketsu, of like put it all together and twist it really tight. And like it does that, not wordlessly is wrong because there are lyrics, but like not through like literal plot action and dialogue, but just through, here's the moment where we see the depths of these people come to the fore, and all that stuff they couldn't put into words come out in a way that everybody else comes to understand, and comes to literally change the bodily behavior of the people around them because everyone is dancing by the end. And like, honestly, as light as this movie is, that's as good an example of the ketsu in a Kisho Tenketsu as I've ever seen.
Yeah, because like that whole notion of the ketsu being, it's the kanji for to tie like a knot, and yes. So it is you're tying together all the little threads some of which, as like a more exploratory Kisho Tenketsu structure allows, some of those threads can feel odd or vague or disconnected in the way of like Dewey having no part whatsoever in the whole drama of the school and them getting caught and them having community service, right? That is like this weird, like we are off on a kind of like a plot island for those moments that don't involve this whole other character. But that emotional journey all comes together, and the Ketsu thing can be more abstract in the way that this is. So yes, I definitely think if you're breaking down the plot, you'd use a Kisho Tenketsu structure, because that is, I think, clearly what they're doing, because it is definitely not a 3-act Hollywood structure. That'd be like a confusing way to sort of try to understand what the movie is doing.
But that's a point I made to my students, is that the 3-act thing, like, it's easier to distinguish between movies that do and don't do that in America than I think Japan. The Kisho Tenketsu is not something that you would use exclusively to talk about like commercial mainstream cinema. It's, like Ozu movies do it and Kurosawa movies do it, and they're extremely different. But yes, like it's a more open form, and I think you can see that at work here in a way that is like quiet but masterful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and there's a couple of like details of the songs I really love. Like one thing I adore is you have Walk. That song ends with this little moment where Kimi, like the music is still playing, and it's kind of like I think they've played their last chord or whatever, and it's kind of, they're letting it hang, and she turns around and walks backwards. And I was a little bit confused, like, what's going on? And then I realized, like, oh, she's walking up to the amplifier, because then you can hear in the mix that there is the distortion on the guitar is causing feedback, even though she doesn't actually play the guitar in that song. But if you do this, if you have an amp turned up and you have your electric guitar plugged into it, if you bring the guitar close to the amp, it will create a feedback, even if you're playing almost nothing. Like any noise that the guitar is making is going to create a feedback loop with the amplifier. And that is obviously a technique that bands have historically like used for this like dissonant distortion noise. And I loved that detail so much, that you can see her walking up slowly to it, and you can hear the distortion and the feedback slowly ramping up in the mix. I'm like, that's really good attention to detail. Not all the guitar stuff is perfect. Like they're definitely, in Apology Letter, there are like some wider shots where they're clearly using a very generic bar chord that is not matching the song at all. But a lot of the guitar stuff is pretty on point, at least based on what I could tell. Like I'm not like a perfect, like I could tell exactly the chord based on hearing it, but she is playing actual chords. Generally speaking, she changes the chords when there's a chord change in the song outside of some of the wider shots. But that little moment in Walk, like that is the beautiful attention to detail in the way the music is assigned and how that is reflecting an action the character is physically doing on screen. That also, it's such a like, kind of artistic musical moment. It's not someone playing a note. It's not someone creating a harmony. It's not someone playing a chord. It is someone creating an intentionally unpleasant sound, because that is part of what the song is about these very difficult and unpleasant emotions the character is feeling. Like, that's just such an awesome part of that whole musical piece.
Couldn't agree more. I'm really glad you brought this up. I also just fucking adored that moment. And yeah, the technicality of the playing for the guitar, at least, isn't quite as perfect as like KyoAni would do it. You can tell like there's not the ludicrous attention to detail that you get like in Haruhi or K-On! But like it's still plenty good to blow you away. And I do think they reserve some of that extra detail for things like the theremin, which is like clearly where I think the effort went in on this more. But like that is such a great moment of character, music, performance, animation, all coming to the same point, and I loved that, because that's the kind of thing that you only get if your director and your composer and everyone are true fucking nerds about this stuff.
Yes.
And like this is not like Yamada Naoko learned about music for this movie. This is just the ocean she swims in every day, I think. And if you watch that video I mentioned that GKids made of her in a record store just talking about her influences, it's so clear how much like this stuff she thinks about all the time.
Yeah, because it's a truly obscure musical detail that you would just never expect to be reflected through a physical action on screen, and it is very, very cool. One other thing with the music, this is not super relevant to the content of the movie, but I did love seeing the subtitles just struggle so hard with how do you subtitle Amen, I'm Going Somewhere, because it's like, it made me, when I was watching the movie, I couldn't figure out what the lyrics she was actually saying were because it was like destroying my brain seeing the English subtitles where they just make shit up basically because you can't translate the key line of of that song. That's like mostly what the lyrics of the whole song are. Because again, this is a Yui song. This is like in K-On! Yui would write a song and it's like 3 lines that are just repeat over and over. In fact, you have that one line in Amen, I'm Going Somewhere. She's like, oh, and yesterday I had some hot udon or whatever. It's just a non sequitur, which is also Yui does almost the exact same thing in K-On! But the key line of the song, that's the main thing of what the song is her just saying the kanji for each of the planets in the solar system because all the planets are like Mars is Kase, Ka being the character for fire, Se being planet. So it's the fire planet. So all of them are like, you have the wood planet, the earth planet, right? All that kind of dirt planet, I guess. Earth is not an earth planet, weirdly enough. And so you have all those. So she's just stringing all the first kanji together of all the different planets. And then at the end of that saying Amen. And then in the English subtitles, they're like, they put the word kin in there because you have Kinsei as one of the planets. I think that's Venus, I believe. So they like put some of the sounds in there because I think like an English speaker will still pick up on some of the sounds and maybe expect them in the subtitles or something. But
because it's so rhythmic, every syllable, and the rhyme is so strong. They're trying to... The thing they should have done is they should have had 2 sets of subtitles there. They should have had Romaji of like the literal words and then like a translation so that you could separate those because you cannot do them both at once where you capture the rhyme scheme and the translation. It's impossible.
Yeah, but it's like it is funny because you just can't, because in the context of the scene in the movie where she comes up with it, with the English subtitles, it kind of doesn't fully make sense because you can't, like, there's the connection between her seeing all the planets in the solar system in their, like, old ancient educational video, which I did like that little detail where she falls asleep and hits her head on the desk. Like, the way the English subtitles translate it, it's a little bit confusing what the connection is there, whereas in Japanese it's like, oh, this makes perfect sense, she's just listing off all the planets. It is very funny to me. It's like, I do not blame the subtitlers. I don't think they did like a bad job doing that. That is just, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place on how the fuck do you handle that. I don't know. I mean, it would be ridiculous to also list off every single planet in English. If you wrote all of their names fully in English, would also not be a great translation because she's not saying the whole planet name, and it also would make for the longest fucking subtitle ever to just list that all out, and you'd have to keep putting it up there every 2 seconds because she says through the line so fast. So it's just a weird, goofy detail.
They did make a full dub for this. What did they do for the songs? Do you have any idea?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. There's not a like English dub soundtrack. I would not be surprised if they just did the songs from the Japanese version. I feel like that's
okay. I'm actually I brought up the trailer and it has a version of the Amen song in English. So they did translate it, and they kept the Amen as the end of the lines for that rhyme scheme. I'd have to look at it more in depth, but because neither of us saw the dub. But yeah, that's a challenge in and of itself. So you and I are probably never going to watch the dub, but I respect the effort.
Yeah, that's just there's no right choice there. There's whatever you're going to do, you're going to do a compromise to translate that.
But that's cool. All right. What else do we have to say about this wonderful movie that you and I said we'd probably go 80 to 90 minutes on and have gone 2 hours on?
Yes. One thing to mention is that, it took me about 30 to 40 minutes of the movie before I could repress my, like, constant thing in the back of my head being like, oh, man, I'd love to take that screenshot. Oh, man, that would be a great fucking screenshot to take. Because for people who listen to our Q&A season, right, like I started that thing of where I started taking screenshots and started with like, I picked like 1 or 2 episodes for a show. I think I did 2 episodes of Air, the Kigami Yoshiji episodes, and took, a couple screenshots. The penultimate episode of Air, I did, I think like 30 or 40 screenshots. And then slowly over the course of that season, I just started doing more episodes and more screenshots for more episodes. And then by the time we got to the Yamada Naoko movies, particularly like Tamako Love Story was the first time this really happened, where it's like, I'm just like screenshotting the whole fucking movie. Like I just watched the whole movie again, screenshotting every 2 or 3 seconds because her storyboarding is so ridiculously rich, particularly on the movies.
Let's talk about this, yeah.
It's obviously true for her TV show episodes as well, but when you have a whole movie, you have the production time of a whole movie, and she's doing the storyboards for the whole thing, like the imagery, the juxtaposition of that imagery, like the meaning it conveys, and then just the raw beauty of it is so incredibly potent that I was just constantly being like, oh, that'd be a great screenshot. Oh, that'd be a great screen. Oh, that'd be a great screenshot. And unfortunately, obviously, this movie, I did check when I got home to see if I could pirate a Japanese version online, but there's not a Japanese copy out either on home video, so I couldn't get one there just to do screenshots again. So we can't go through the like incredibly specific shot composition breakdown we did on some of the like silent voice and stuff because I don't have all the screenshots. But this movie is so gorgeous. Every single shot is one it's that sort of, every frame is one that could be a painting, or every frame is one that could be your wallpaper. Like, it is so beautiful, but they all convey so much meaning for what the movie is doing that it is a breathtaking experience in that regard.
Yes, and obviously many people's contributions go in to make each one of those frames gorgeous. When we're talking about the storyboarding specifically, and I'm explaining this to my students in my animation class, because this we don't really say this for live action movies. Live action movies often are storyboarded, but it's a slightly different process because it doesn't have to be as rigorous, and there's more room to change later on. But we were talking about like what makes good storyboarding, and why can you say the storyboarding is good even if you and I have not looked at the literal storyboards of this movie. It's because what you're talking about is the overall shape of the frame, the overall composition, and the way they interrelate. So like Yamada Naoko really likes to do shots, and I think she particularly started this with A Silent Voice, where she will have a character in like a lower quadrant of the frame, and then on the reverse, the other character on the opposite lower quadrant, with a lot of what is technically negative space around them, but she'll often fill it with something very like symbolically or literally meaningful. She likes those kinds of shots. Or the way, like in terms of interrelation of shots, this is something she definitely picked up from other people at Kyoto Ani, and I think has gradually made her own, but cutting to like below the table when they are talking, or cutting to little moments of visual symbolism where I think these are really strong. Like in A Silent Voice, I picked up on one early in the movie. Shoya gives the little sister character an old pair of his shoes because she's run away from home and doesn't have shoes. And way on the other side of the movie, when he's in the hospital, it cuts to her, and then it cuts to her feet and shows the shoes again, and then cuts back. And it's unspoken, but it's meant to remind you that like she is literally wearing a thing that he gave her, and like this is important to her. There's a lot of moments like that in Colors Within. One of my favorites that I picked up on is early in the movie when I think they're first doing some band rehearsal together, and Totsuko is still a little like not fully into her I'm sleeping on Kimi's lap every day kind of best friend, right? There's this shot to one of like the little setups that Rui has made, and there's two power lines that have like end in those like copper or like metal ends, and they're meant to be like linked up at the end, and they'll meet up, and they haven't met up yet. And it's a quiet shot over there, and it doesn't have to comment on itself, but it's an obvious little bit of, as storyboard in the movie, like, oh, here's a way to visualize the relationship that I'm thinking about, and there's the composition, and then we cut back. And it's that kind of stuff that I think is, that kind of stuff specifically is very Ozu-esque if you're thinking in like Japanese history of the kind of cutaways that, and Ozu would often make them a little more oblique. These are a little more forthrightly symbolic, but it's something that she's so good at. And then I think just overall, like her understanding of the 185:1 shape, the normal kind of what we call flat widescreen, and I think she often thinks of it as kind of a 4-quadrant thing. If you look at her geometric compositions of kind of what's happening in each fourth of the frame is often how she puts it together. But I think of it as very geometric. And it's just, that's all the basic storyboarding stuff. And then people come in and fill it out, and the layouts will get more detailed, and you're going to have a background artist do cool stuff. But just those basics, like the foundation, is so strong, and it's like, it's so distinctive too. There's lots of great storyboarders and directors. Most great directors are great storyboarders, but often without that just sheer amount of signature to it that I think you feel from Yamada, who picked up the whole KyoAni kind of house style and then added all of her own stuff, and it's this rich tradition in her storyboards.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is the sense of that juxtaposition of the images, as you're saying, that geometric use of the frame, which is obviously a very KyoAni like thing, right? It's stuff you see with all like the great KyoAni directors, obviously coming from, I think, most fundamentally Kigami Yoshiji's tradition, and then him passing it down through his like sort of mentorship to the various other directors like Takimoto Yasuhiro and stuff, and Ishihara at that studio. And so there's just such a sort of solid sense of how to construct things in the frame to create strong visual interest, and then also to create that sense of meaning. Like there's a lot of, especially all the stuff at like the old abandoned church, there's just such great use of that space, and like the lattices on the window to separate the characters when you're peering through the window from the outside into the church, and that like creates physical separation in the breakup of the image. There's so much stuff like that, but then there's also stuff you're talking about of those cutaways to things that symbolically represent different elements of what the characters are feeling or going through. One of the ones that's like I think a very obvious one, but is like works really well, is when they cut to the school on the Valentine Day festival or whatever. It's like this outside shot, and you have this tree or like branch in the foreground, and there are 3 birds on the branch. 2 of them are nestled up, and the third one alights on the branch and then goes and nestles up with the other 2 as well. Obviously, like, standing in for the characters who have all come together and to form this one unit, like this little family. There's just so much stuff like that, and it is the thing that creates that sense of space we talk about. Like that is, I think, the most important thing. The details and the setting and all that are also very important, but the most important thing is just creating that sense of the world through the visual representation in the storyboarding, and then the way that is paced through with the editing and the juxtaposition of those images. Like that is the fundamental thing that she is so good at. That is the thing that stands out, particularly from all of her stuff Tamako Love Story on. It's really phenomenal. And then there is like also a lot of stuff that's just like where you feel that KyoAni heritage. I think one of my favorite shots that feels like a Takimoto Yasuhiro tribute shot or something, and also just the thing to like, I don't know, maybe there was like an animator she was frustrated with and just wanted to make his work very hard. There's that one shot early in the movie in Kimi's room where she's got the fucking Newton's cradle. And there's this shot that's like the whole frame is this close up on the Newton's cradle where you see all like 5 or 6 of the little round, like mirror fucking polished metal orbs. And she like reaches towards it, and you see in the reflection, and it's a different reflection on all of them because they're so small. That little difference of distance means the perspective for all the balls is going to be different on the reflection. But because she's reaching towards it, and they're so small, the reflection is so incredibly distorted on the arm as it's reaching forward to grab the ball and then pull it away, and so the reflection has to move with it. And it's just like, god damn, that is such a complicated reflection-based shot. That is the kind of thing that Takimoto Yasuhiro did all the time. Every episode he did on Sound Euphonium had about a dozen shots of Kimiko in the reflection of her euphonium and stuff like that. And it's like that is both a really cool, powerful shot. The way that the reflections are spaced out, obviously, like reflections are like so inherently cinematic and carry so much inherent symbolic meaning, that it's a very potent thing to do. And obviously lots of movies use reflections incredibly well. But in animation, it's such a complicated thing to do. And especially on a fucking little tiny metal ball like that, where you're reaching to pick it up, and have it be moving. And it's a killer shot, and also just like a wild shot to do. And there's a bunch of stuff like that. There's a couple of shots of that Newton's cradle, but the first one is the most like, I'm just like throwing down the gauntlet. I'm going to make this the sickest looking reflection shot you can think of.
The Takamoto connection is absolutely right on, because you're so right. But also it is something you remember, like, the director storyboards this alone and has to quickly sketch it. And then I wonder if there's ever like, oh man, someone's going to have to animate that. Well, we'll figure that out when we get there, because I think it's like when you write a movie, you can't limit yourself by the budget. Like, you figure that out later, you can't, a good script, you can't just be thinking about that the whole time. I think that's true of storyboards too. I think you have to kind of throw the gauntlet down, and if you have to cut back later, you have to cut back later. But yeah, it's, because that is something that was really cool about watching this for me, Sean, and I bet we'll have the same feeling with Heike Story, is seeing all the KyoAni influences that will be in Yamada Naoko forever, but also like where she continually is pushing in her own direction. And I think that push and pull is really productive and cool. And you know, I was wondering like what going into this movie, like how different will it be? And it's funny because it's not a Kyoto Animation movie, you can tell.
Yeah.
But obviously so much of that DNA just naturally exists.
Yeah, absolutely. In this realm of the movie, I think the other sequence, this is not just storyboarding, it's also the technical animation that is hugely impressive, is also just I think one of the most interesting scenes in the movie contextually in terms of the narrative is post the concert. You've got Totsuko walking outside and then doing the ballet dance to Giselle on the fucking theremin.
Yes.
Which is such a striking scene, both because it's obviously like people dancing. That's a classically complicated thing to animate that is also just looks gorgeous on screen when it's done really well. And so it's so cool here. It's obviously like the big culminating moment for our protagonist, who is the one who I think is least important in the concert, right? The concert feels like it exists there for Dewey and Kimi to transform most of all. Then Totsuko needs to have this own kind of private moment here with this dance. The one of the things that's really striking about it to me, though, is like when I was watching the movie, I feel like you can't quite tell if that's literally happening or if that is a like expressionistic moment. Like, did she actually walk outside and is actually dancing to music that's in her head? Or is this just showing us in her mind's eye, in her like soul, basically, this is what she has gained, is this ability to do this thing she felt like she could never do, right? She's this very modest, humble person who puts herself down. And that's the big thing in the church scene where she talks about all this stuff, is where the dance comes up for the first time and she does the little dance in the church, is she puts herself down as like, oh, I just sort of, you know, mess around with it. I mostly learned just by watching the other kids. And she puts herself down so much as like, I'm not impressive. It's nothing about me. And so then her being able to sort of like explode into this beautiful movement of this dance. And then obviously she reaches up to the sun to block her eye and she looks up at her hand and sees her color is red. It's a really great climactic moment for that character, but it's also just this fascinating moment that exists in this slightly different space and world than anything else in the movie does.
Absolutely, because the background quality is pretty different in that scene, and like the colors used, and it's softer. It's a little more existing in her kind of interior watercolor world, although with this like hyper realistic animation on the dance. And yeah, I think you can read it either way, and that's part of what works. Is that like it is inherently impressionistic, but I think it's also about whether it's in her head or she's actually out there dancing. It is about self-perception one way or the other. It is about a different self-perception having unlocked. And so the fact that it looks different and feels different plays into both of those readings. And it is just the right... I mean, it's a really good example of a denouement of a story. This is another concept I've been teaching my students, and I've been giving them different examples. And I think this is a very good one because of how it's a purely visual denouement. It's just completely about the sensory experience of the moment.
Yeah, and it's just, it's such a great way to cap off the movie for Totsuko, where you've got this purely musical big climax where you get 3 full songs, and then you get another kind of musical moment that is expressed through physical movement, and in this case through the animation of that movement. And there's just something about this movie that the way that it ends is so non-narrative in that sense is really perfect for the whole atmosphere and world and kind of thing that the movie was up till this point. And so the ending being a concert and then a dance scene that exists in like a almost kind of dream space is this like ultimate expression of this internal journey that the movie was going through. And it's the thing that makes the climax so potent and so powerful, is it's just different than these kinds of scenes you've seen in other movies. And it sort of helps mark how different this movie is from the movies that it sort of superficially resembles.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is The Colors Within, Kimi no Iro. It's wonderful. Made me nostalgic for it wasn't that long ago, but for our entire Kyoto Animation season. And excited for whenever we get around to Science SARU. This was great, and I'm glad we both went to see it in a theater and got to talk about it, because this is a movie I just desperately wanted to talk about when it was done. I think it demands that kind of like unpacking, so it's great.
Yeah, 2 thumbs up. People should see it.
Absolutely. So yeah, go see it in whatever theater is nearest to you. It's a wonderful theatrical experience. Looks great up there on the big screen because other than watching A Silent Voice in my class the other night, this is the first of her stuff I've actually gotten to see in a theater. So that was really cool. So we will be back with more Japanimation Station in the weeks to come. Obviously, Season 5 premiering March 16th. We might have an episode on that Gundam G-Quack's beginning movie event they're doing on February 28th. So keep an eye out for that if we're both able to make it to that. And it's going to be a big year for the show because we've got Season 5. Eventually, we'll have that Tomino season premiering. We've got a new Gundam show this year. I think 2025 is going to be a very good year for Japanimation Station.
Absolutely. I'm very excited for what's to come. But just to give people a moment to prepare, if you're eyeing that March 16th date, do keep in mind, I would recommend to start watching Dragon Ball GT now if you want to be ready for that premiere. So just, that first part is going to be episodes 1 to 22 and episodes 23 to 40. 1 to 22 is the Dark Dragon Ball arc and 23 to 40 is the Baby arc. We have already recorded those podcasts, so I can tell you, buckle in.